Vanessa was on her way to her mother Jessica's hospital. On the way, she was leafing through a fashion magazine she found on a bench at the bus stop. Rich, beautiful, and successful models with perfect makeup and hairstyles, dressed in clothes of famous brands, looked at the girl from the pages. Their beauty was so bright, so perfect, that Vanessa did not even think of envy. It didn't occur to her that she could look good in expensive clothes after a visit to the salon. There was no room for anything expensive in her and her mother's quiet and modest life. Her mother had worked as a nurse in a polyclinic all her life, with occasional part-time jobs as an orderly and cleaner. Vanessa tried to help her as much as possible. The girl never asked about her father. Only once her mother misspoke, saying that people like him would never get in touch with people like them. What did she mean, and what hidden meaning did she put in that phrase? It remained a mystery to Vanessa. In her earliest childhood, the girl had been terribly curious to know who her daddy was. She didn't dare to ask about him as a child, so she could fantasize about him as much as she wanted. The fact that he was not written in her birth documents added even more mystery to him. The girl grew up, and with her grew the role of her father in her fantasies. In time, she began to imagine that he spent his life performing important and dangerous tasks. He was strictly forbidden to disclose the family. That's why she and her mom lived in this tiny, forgotten town. Living in it, it was absolutely impossible to believe that some 200 kilometers away was the brilliant city of New York, in which life was boiling and beating key. And their life didn't even flow, it barely ebbed and flowed, finding its way among the eternal busyness of the mother and the quiet, imperceptible hobbies of the daughter. Vanessa herself didn't remember at what point she started writing down her thoughts, dreams about her father, and life stories. By the time she reached the age of consciousness, she had accumulated so many such records that it would be enough for a small book. Going through the records, the girl acquired her first dream to publish a book and become a writer in that order. After all, she needed the approval of her readers to continue. For now, only two obstacles separated her from the moment when the manuscript would see the light of day: money and fear. Fear that her work would not be appreciated. Are you kidding me? Vanessa couldn't say she was unhappy. Mom Jessica, despite the busyness and complete lack of money, always tried to pay attention to her daughter, to please, hug, and cheer up. The girl grew up in love and therefore not so acutely felt the lack of some things: fashionable clothes, expensive toys, and sweets. Every weekend, Mom took the girl by the hand and they went to the park or the forest to walk, get acquainted with nature, feed ducks or fish. Once in class, answering the teacher's question, how she knows so much about animals, plants, nature, the girl told about their little tradition with her mother. So she, without wanting to, and without knowing it, made her first enemy a classmate, Kiara. Kiara grew up in a rich family, but she saw no love, no attention, no care. Expensive toys could not replace parents. Fancy clothes, lively communication, and gadgets, family warmth. The fact that Vanessa possessed all of these things, and therefore bypassed her, ignited an envy in Kiara that quickly turned to hatred. Thoughts jumped around in the girl's head like hairs from one memory to another. Apparently, she was ready to think about anything but the fact that the bus would stop at the end of the ride. Vanessa would get off at the final stop and go to the hospital. There, for the second week, her mom was in the hospital with no hope of recovery. The doctor repeatedly offered to discharge her home, to live with her family and friends. Vanessa refused. For Jessica's mom, she was the only family and friends she had. But there was no strength to support her mom at all. They were barely enough to drive to her mom's house every day, bring home cooked meals, and stay cheerful. Returning home, she would close the door and slowly slump down on it, biting her lip in pain. The nearest, dearest, and only dear person in her life was leaving. There was nothing she could do about it. One of the orderlies hinted for the girl to start preparing. For what? Vanessa clapped her eyes in bewilderment, not really understanding what she was talking about. And she did. For what? Not for the discharge, for the funeral. What funeral? What are you talking about? Mom will recover and will live like we used to. We'd like that to happen, but this disease doesn't give us a chance. You're wrong. You're wrong. Mom's strong, she'll be fine. Besides, the doctor offered to discharge her. Yes, to live to avoid spending state funds. The woman grinned loudly. Here, Derevyanko, take this and you'll need it. and she handed Vanessa neatly folded bills. "No need, we don't need anything." The catchphrase of all those who really need everything. "Maybe not you, but you should see your mother off. I'll tell you everything in order tomorrow, or you'll forget something. I told you, you don't have to teach me anything or explain anything. Mom and I are fine." Only 5 days later, Vanessa sobbed in the arms of the same nurse, unable to accept the fact that she was all alone in the world. The old woman stroked her head and quietly repeated that everything would be all right, that Mom was now in a better world, she was not hurt or scared there. And Vanessa thought how scary it is when there are no close and dear people. Not at all. This nurse will wait for the girl to calm down and go about her business. And in a couple of days, she'll forget about Vanessa and her grief. And Vanessa will stay and continue to live in a world where no one is interested in how she is and how she feels. Suddenly, the nurse said a phrase that, in fact, turned the girl's consciousness upside down and subsequently completely changed her life. "And cry now, you and your mother to bury, and father to support. Men bear grief worse," said the nurse. "I've never seen yours." When she realized that she had said something wrong, the woman continued. "Do you have one, your father?" "No, and never had one," Vanessa answered. "How come?" "I don't know. I've never seen him. My mom never told me." "But any other relatives?" "No one. Mom was the only one." It's impossible for a man to be alone. If your parents broke up when you were young, foolishly, and then your pride didn't allow you to reconcile, and your father lives somewhere, does not know that he has a beautiful daughter. Then Vanessa did not pay attention to the words of a kind woman, who, by the way, really helped the girl with the organization of the funeral. Advised and prompted how and what should be done. Without her, Vanessa would not have done even half of what she had to do. In the evening after the funeral, Vanessa remembered the nurse's words. "Except to say search, and it's easy." And where to begin the search, thought the girl, absolutely no idea. And she decided to start with taking apart her mother's archive, a massive old dresser filled with various useful and useless but memorable things. Several drawers were occupied by Vanessa's mother's document school, leaving certificates, diplomas, letters, and photos. As a child, the girl often went through them in search of something interesting. Then she didn't pay much attention to old photographs and letters, half of which she couldn't even read because of illegible handwriting. Today she wanted to study everything thoroughly. Among the papers, she found the deeds to the apartment. It turned out that the apartment had belonged to her for many years. A deed of gift had been made in her name, but the name of the donor was unfamiliar to Vanessa, and the date was approximately the same as the date of birth of the girl. After spending the night without sleep, trying to make sense of everything that was stored in her mother's dresser, by morning Vanessa was forced to admit that she had learned nothing new. The letters stored were from her parents' girlfriends. Vanessa knew Mom's parents had left this world long before she came along. Mom had been in medical school then. Barely self-sufficient, she was left alone. Then she'd found support in friends and a certain David. Vanessa was interested in the mention of the young man, but he was only mentioned a couple of times. Not enough for the man who later became the father of her child. And the references were odd. David brought her, drove her, helped her. It was like she wasn't talking about her lover, but a longshoreman. Unpacking the largest box of letters, the girl at the bottom found a postcard from a Black Sea resort. "Strange," Vanessa said to herself. Mom never said she had been to the sea. The postcard was addressed to her parents. It said that the girl was doing well and the vacation was going well. Well, it turns out Mom had a busy life, and I saw her always busy, tired, running from one job to another, thought Vanessa. In another box, as if to confirm her thoughts, Vanessa found a photo of her mother from the seashore. She was looking at her as a young girl, no more than 20 years old. She was smiling radiantly, hugging the young man around the waist. The problem was that the young man himself was mercilessly torn from the photo. Neither his face nor even his height could be determined. So interesting, Vanessa said. So Mom went on vacation with a certain young man. Probably, most likely, my father. Apparently, their relationship didn't work out with my mom. She threw his picture away and never told me anything. After rummaging through the rest of the papers, hoping to find the second part of the photo, Vanessa had to give up. Dawn was dawning outside the window. She began to drift off to sleep. In her dream, she saw her mother young and cheerful again. She was running along the edge of the sea and laughing. A young man was following her with big steps. He opened his arms, trying to catch the girl in his arms, but each time she managed to slip out of his reach. Vanessa tried to see the young man's face, but it kept dissolving in the glare of the sun. Vanessa awoke just before noon. The June sun was shining brightly outside the window. She had to decide how to live in general and what to do today in particular. She decided to start by tidying up the apartment to take her mind off things. But even while she was busy with her physical work, she couldn't stop thinking about how to move on. Vanessa had a brilliant 9th grade school certificate and a red diploma from the teacher's college she had entered after a classmate, Kiara, had made her stay at school unbearable. Vanessa could not understand when she crossed the road daughter of rich parents and what earned her hatred. Just one day the girl hated her a quiet, unremarkable, excellent student who never said a word against anyone. Kiara turned out to be very persistent and inventive in terms of mischief. In just 3 years, she had developed such an active activity to turn Vanessa's life into a nightmare that the famous quiet girl had no choice but to look for a suitable school and transfer. It was pointless to change schools. Kiara had acquaintances everywhere. So Vanessa, at the age of 18, was almost a specialist. However, she did not have time to rejoice in her diploma. The departure of her mother made all the joys dim and insignificant. For a whole week, Vanessa tried to find a job by specialty in schools and kindergartens. It turned out that no one needed young specialists with a great desire to work, but a complete lack of experience. The money, which after the funeral was left very little, quickly ran out, and Vanessa had to sharply lower the bar of requirements for work. Now she was happy to take any position as long as she could get money for food. She posted her resume everywhere she could, but no one was willing to hire her. Finally, late one night, the phone rang. "Vanessa, good afternoon. You placed an ad for a job. Is it still up to date?" asked on the other end of the line. "Yes, of course," replied the girl, practically jumping with joy with the receiver in her hands. "Are you not embarrassed by the offer to work as a maid?" "No, I'm ready for any kind of work now." "Great. Then they'll be expecting you tomorrow. I'll text you the address. Try to be there no later than 10. The personnel manager is a finicky man. He doesn't like to be late," the phone said. "By the way, are you ready to move to the employer's house?" "Yes, I guess I'm ready." "Where does he live?" "Staten Island." "In principle, you can come from home, but we have situations when you need to stay longer or get up early." "Where is Staten Island?" "I don't know," Vanessa admitted, who had never left her hometown. "Staten Island is a borough of New York City. That's the city you listed on your resume." Vanessa remembered that she had actually written that in a few sentences, not really hoping for a response. "I probably won't make it by 10 tomorrow. I live in another city." "Which one?" asked on the other end of the line. Having heard the answer, the interlocutor didn't seem to be surprised. "In the morning, you will take the train from your city. It leaves at 6, and you will be met at the station. If you are ready to work, pack everything you need at once." "What exactly would I need to be a maid?" Vanessa asked. Ahead, at least, the caller grinned and hung up. Vanessa sat down on the floor, puzzled. The offer was as unexpected and mysterious as possible. They were ready to send an automobile to the train for the maid. She was so surprised by this offer that she forgot to ask about salary and working conditions. And what was the point of these questions? After all, the girl had never worked. She did not even have a labor book. Besides, the money was enough only for a ticket. Well, it's not much of a choice to starve here for another week, or to take a risk and go to work in the city of dreams. "I think the decision is obvious. I'm going," the girl said to herself and went to pack her things. Vanessa, who had never left the city, was faced with a very difficult choice. But what to take with her on the trip? What would come in handy for work? How would she leave the apartment? With the apartment account, the solution was obvious: give the keys to her neighbor to keep an eye on her. Late one night, Vanessa knocked on the neighbor's door. "Jessica, could you help me out?" she asked. "Yes, Vanessa, what's wrong? What are you doing up so late?" "I already went to bed," the neighbor replied. Vanessa knew perfectly well that the neighbor was lying. No one knew when she slept or if she slept at all. She was awake at all hours of the day and always saw and heard everything. She was aware of every incident, every gossip, every scandal. "Jessica, I have to leave early tomorrow morning. I'll leave the spare keys. You keep an eye on the apartment," Vanessa said. "Where do you think you're going?" The girl's first impulse was to keep silent. After all, tomorrow not only the whole entrance, but the whole city will know about her plans, if anyone in the city is even interested in her modest person. However, having judiciously reasoned that to go to an unknown place, without warning anyone, is definitely not worth it, she replied. "I'm going to New York to get a job. We couldn't find anything here. We need something to live on." "Are you going to look for your father?" the woman asked in a bizarre way. "Who?" "You know, my father. I thought he was from New York." "How do you even know about my father? My mom never told me anything about him." There was nothing to tell. They didn't even get to know each other before she got pregnant and he ran away from her. "How do you know that?" "We moved into this apartment when I was born." The woman hesitated. It was obvious that she was trying to find the words to answer. "Well, people said that you were born to some important man. That's the apartment your mother was given. But your parents didn't have anything serious. I don't know anything else. Don't ask. You know me. I've got no bones in my mouth." "What I would have known, I would have told you," the old woman said, as Vanessa prepared to ask more. "I'm going to apply for a job as a maid in the house of some wealthy man. I'll write to you as soon as I'm settled." "Of course you will. What if they take away your passport and take you where?" "To the border." Vanessa was surprised. "You may be quiet, but you're a good-looking girl." "Jessica, don't worry. They won't like someone like me," she shook her head. "Well, you shouldn't be like that. Your mother, she was the same." All her life, Vanessa considered herself unworthy of relationships. Everyone was ashamed that she was raised by her mother without a husband. And the guys who were chasing her long ago, maybe they could have lifted her out of poverty. She'd be alive now. "I feel sorry for Vanessa." The old woman really well treated the young, quiet neighbor, who alone tried to raise her daughter, Kiara. It was a shame that she, having lived such a hard life, had left this world so young. Vanessa's mom was barely over 40. However, she looked in recent years no less than 60. Classmates took her for Vanessa's grandmother, and only she saw her as a beauty. And here, perhaps also a neighbor. Having collected everything necessary, Vanessa packed a change of clothes, documents, and the rest of the money. The girl closed the apartment and went to the train station. There were only a couple hours left before the train. Staying alone in the apartment was becoming more and more difficult. A city station at any time of the day is quite a sight. Not for nothing they say that train stations have seen more sincere love than marriage palaces. Vanessa witnessed the real emotions of parting, meeting, friendship, and love. It's as if at the moment of the last meeting before the road or the first after the separation, people's soul opens a little wider, and only the most sincere emotions are the first to burst out of it. Later, when the moment passes, people become more reserved and reserved. When the train came to the platform, the girl turned around for the last time and looked at the city she had grown up in and was now leaving, without much regret. I must say, what, in fact, can these streets and houses mean if there is no one left in the city who is dear to your heart? It so happened that she had no school friends and girlfriends. Or rather, once they had been, but the incomprehensible war, which was declared to her by a classmate, made everyone turn away from her. For 3 years of this war, not only Vanessa and all the other guys could not understand why Kiara was so beaten up on her. The fact that a rich, fashionable girl could simply envy the quiet Vanessa didn't even cross anyone's mind. For some reason, it was at the moment of leaving town that Vanessa remembered her high school years. Probably so that she finally confirmed the correctness of the decision to leave the city and not return. Sitting in the station building, she decided that she would stay in New York, and if the maid job didn't work out, she would find another one. The main thing to get a foothold in the big city. and return to her native tiny town without the prospect of forever will have time. Having made up her mind, she entered the carriage, changed her clothes, and fell into a sound and healthy sleep for the first time in months. Shortly before arriving at the New York train station, her phone rang. "Vanessa, are you there?" "Yes, in half an hour." "Yes." "Great. There's a car waiting for you." The caller gave the license plate number and a parking spot. Sitting in the cabin, she looked around the city with amazement. It seemed that she was in a fairy tale. Beautiful old buildings, bridges, parks, as if descended from the illustrations of fashion magazines. And here, amidst all this splendor, she was to live. Vanessa didn't think at all about the work she had to do. She was not afraid of hard or dirty work. She realized that she could hardly expect anything more now. But one thing she knew for sure was that she was not leaving this city. From the busy streets, the driver turned into a picturesque area. Multi-story buildings were replaced by beautiful mansions. Vanessa didn't even try to imagine who could live in them and what kind of income they had. She heard that the driver called someone and asked which exit to take the girl to. After getting an answer, he drove into the gate of one of the mansions and parked the car. Vanessa sat in a small, cozy lobby, waiting for the personnel manager. He turned out to be a short man, slightly over 40, athletic and focused. "Vanessa, I'm the one who called you. Come on, I'll familiarize you with your duties, show you how everything works here." "Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to work and bringing me here. I'm so grateful." "You'll thank me when you've worked here. You'll thank me when you've worked here. You may think it's a tough job. A lot of people can't handle it. But in fact, if you try hard enough, you can do it all." "Do you have any cleaning skills?" "I hope so. I used to help my mom at work a lot." "What was Mom like?" "She was a nurse and a hospital nurse. I worked with her to make it easier for her." "Mom doesn't work now." "Mom died a little over 2 weeks ago." Vanessa didn't notice the man clenching his jaw, as if in pain, but continued talking. "I'm sorry for your loss. We have a somewhat specific cleaning service. As you can see, the interior is very expensive. So for now, your duties will include cleaning the back rooms, the staff rooms, assisting the kitchen staff, let's just say interning on the sidelines. There will be 4 other girls interning with you. Only 2 will stay on. We're not fully staffed yet, so you could be useful in other jobs." "Is there anyone living in the house?" "Not yet. The owner lived abroad for a long time. The house was completed only last year and just the other day finished repair, decoration, and design. So we are still recruiting staff. If you work and show diligence, you will have quite decent positions." "Wages. Are you happy with it, by the way?" "I don't know, you haven't told me. I don't know." The man stopped so abruptly that Vanessa ran into him. "So you left your hometown and came to an unfamiliar metropolis without even finding out the terms of cooperation? What do I have to lose? I can't get a better job. I can always come back and get a job as a cleaner or a saleswoman. What have I got to lose?" "Yes, only at 18 you can think so recklessly." It seemed that the last phrase was addressed to myself. How much will I get? Based on the fact that you are a non-professional, inexperienced employee, plus you will live here and be provided with uniforms and food, about $50,000 a month. For the first month you will work without days off, the man warned when he saw the girl's face stretch after the sum was announced. Are you serious? For a maid's job plus food, lodging and clothing is a dream. I don't quite understand you. Are you against it? I'm all for it. Yes, we're ready to work weekends, but also without lunch and sleep. Yes, just leave me alone. So you're happy with the terms? Yes. Great. Here's your room being set up. I'll see you downstairs in an hour. There'll be a general briefing and staff introductions. I'll be alone in the room? Of course. This isn't a dormitory. The landlord has a very human attitude towards people, including the servants. Thank you very much. Vanessa pressed herself against the man in a grateful impulse and felt for a moment that he wanted to respond to the embrace, but held back. Maybe in a hug too. I think it's unnecessary," the man began, but Vanessa didn't listen. "Thank you again. I'll do my best. I hope to see you in an hour. The uniforms are in the closet." For the first few minutes, Vanessa couldn't believe her happiness. More demanding girls might have thought, how can anyone be excited about the prospect of being a maid? But to her, it was fabulous luck, and she didn't want to miss the opportunity. Half an hour later, she was ready and standing in the hallway, trying to remember how to get to the lobby where all the staff was supposed to gather. The corridor was empty. It was quiet outside the room doors. The girl regretted not looking around as she walked and completely forgot to ask for directions to the lobby. Finally, she managed to get to the stairs, going down into a spacious room. The employees were already starting to gather there. Several girls, apparently also maids, were already drinking, getting acquainted and chatting. Besides them were the cook, several of his assistants, the gardener, the guards, the head maid, and the driver, who had brought Vanessa. The girl was just about to approach the others to get acquainted. But at that moment, the man who was introducing her to the house walked in. Suddenly, she realized that she hadn't even asked his name. That's a really strange impression she made on him, without asking his name, or working conditions, or the size of his salary. But she packed up and drove from her hometown to huge New York. "Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Alan, the house manager. I'm going to introduce you to the house rules. Most of the information you've already received. In addition, each of you has a small handout in your room regarding your responsibilities. I suggest you study them, especially for those who have no experience. The house is new, and the owners will move in only in a month. During this time, you and I need to get used to it and learn to work together as a team. You'll find the daily schedule in the room. We'll start living by it tomorrow. Today, familiarization with the house, responsibilities. I warn at once, personal relations, violation of discipline, bad habits, the reason for dismissal without clarification. For all this, you will have a weekend in the house. You are obliged to behave with dignity. The master is a man strict, conservative. Living in the house, he will be with his spouse and son. Perhaps his son's sweetheart will live in the house." "How old are they all?" one of the maid girls asked. "The master's name is David. He and his wife Addison are 45. His son Matthew is 23. His girlfriend Ciara is just over 18. If I'm not mistaken. Our host is the owner of a large gemstone mining and processing corporation. His wife is the owner of a jewelry manufacturing firm. His son has recently finished his studies in England and will help his father in his business. But for any questions, you should contact me. Try to keep contact with family members to a minimum. They are reserved people, and this many strangers is also very stressful for them. They will bring in a staff member to clean their private rooms and serve at the table." "It's complicated," said one of the girls. "If you are not satisfied with these complications, you can always tell me and we will find a replacement for you," the man said calmly. No, I'm fine with it." Vanessa listened and could not believe her own ears. How far this world was from the one she lived in. Vanessa spent half the day learning the rules and duties, the routines. She walked around the part of the house where she was to work. Vanessa got to know all the staff. She was in such a confused state that she could not fully comprehend the amount of change that had taken place in her life. Perhaps it is only when you are young that you can be so carefree to enjoy everything and change your life so easily. From the next day, her labor career began. Accustomed to labor, the girl did not experience special difficulties, quickly performing the entire amount of work. It was for this that the other maids began to dislike her. The work, designed for the whole day, she performed in a few hours, not distracted by conversations. As a result, Alan began to grumble at the others, who were much less eager to work than Vanessa. By the end of the month, the entire staff had settled in, learned their duties, and established interpersonal relationships. Fortunately, fears of romance at work were completely unfounded. Almost all of the adult staff were married, and the maid girls were not interested in the single Alan, the driver, an unloved and withdrawn guy in his 30s. He was also to fulfill the duties of a security guard should the need arise. From one day to the next, the arrival of the family was awaited. Their rooms were ready the day before their arrival. Their assistant Chloe arrived to check on the final preparations. She appeared to be a stern and collected woman whose age was impossible to determine. She was equally likely to be in her 30s or 50s. One day, Vanessa decided to ask Alan a question that had been bothering her for a long time. "Alan, please tell me, why do you never call anyone by their middle name? Everyone, including yourself. Do you introduce only by first name?" "It's a habit we picked up while we were living in England. There are no middle names there. Everyone calls each other by first or last name. David and Addison should be called that too, but I told you not to go near them yet." I remember. The arrival of the hosts was not a special event for the staff. The cook cooked lunch, got orders for dinner. Chloe herself gave all the orders, working surprisingly well with Alan. The young maid girl suggested that they might well be having an affair. For dinner, they waited for the arrival of Ciara, the future daughter-in-law of the owners. The girl had been born and raised in Russia, but had spent the last few years in England, where she had met Matthew. The girl's father had a brilliant career, so she was a favorable party. She was to be surprised and charmed. What was Vanessa's surprise when she recognized her former classmate in the girl who arrived, the same one who had made her school years a living hell. Vanessa realized that as soon as Ciara saw her and recognized her, her days in this house would be numbered. So she had to do everything to make sure that the girl, the daughter-in-law of the master's son, did not notice her. Fortunately, the young people just a couple of weeks later went on vacation to one of the resorts. Sitting in the city in the summer was really unbearable. One day, Vanessa came running into one of the rooms, checking the dust on the top shelf of a massive closet. Getting to it with her short stature was impossible. She had to use a small ladder. Engrossed in her work, she didn't immediately notice she wasn't alone in the room. That's why when Matthew, who was watching her, coughed softly, she flinched, lost her balance, and fell down the stairs. Although the stairs were not high, the bruise from the fall could have been quite painful and serious if Matthew hadn't caught her on the fly. Tall and athletic, he picked up the petite girl as if she were nothing. For a few moments he held her in his arms, keeping his admiring gaze on her. It was the first time Vanessa had ever caught such a look of admiration. Since high school, she had been accustomed to thinking of herself as inconspicuous, unassuming, unworthy of attention. In college, the situation was no different. The few boys paid no attention to her, which, combined with her unremarkable appearance, made her insecure. But now, when she was held in the arms of a stunningly handsome, tall, strong and confident young man, literally eating her up with his eyes, Vanessa felt confident, strong and charming, as if she were wearing a stunning outfit rather than a modest uniform. "I apologize if I startled you," Matthew said. His voice was like black velvet, enveloping me with softness. Vanessa said, "I'm very grateful to you. Could you put me down on the floor? Someone might come in. It would be a bad situation. I can explain everything to them." Matthew didn't seem to think of obeying her request, as if he realized that what she was saying was the exact opposite of what she wanted. "I have to insist," she said. Putting Vanessa on the floor, he held her in his arms for a few moments, pressing her gently against him and not letting her break free. Unable to tear her gaze away from him, Vanessa admired the perfect appearance of her master's son. Those rare moments when she did get to see him, she thought only of avoiding Ciara's eyes. Looking at her fiancé was something Vanessa dared not think about. But now she stood in the embrace of his strong arms and could think of nothing but how beautiful these moments were. As if with great regret, the young man unclasped his hands, releasing the girl. It should be noted, he did it very timely. Vanessa had no sooner taken a couple of steps toward the door than Lucinda entered the living room through the other entrance. "Honey, there you are. I've been looking all over for you," she said. Hearing the familiar voice behind her, Vanessa hurried to retrace her steps and hide in the nearest room. Closing the door and leaning against it, she tried to calm her frantic heartbeat for a few minutes. She herself couldn't answer exactly what caused it, the unexpected meeting with Ciara or the embrace of her fiancé. I should be more careful, Vanessa thought. Today she'll notice me, tomorrow she'll remember me. And the day after tomorrow I'll go back to my small town. Since that day, the girl tried her best not to be seen by any of the owners of the house, but it was much more difficult to command her heart. And is it possible at the age of 18? Vanessa fell in love with the son of the owner and could not command her heart not to long for the handsome young man, despite the fact that she had no chance to reciprocate. The next week passed relatively quietly. Matthew and Ciara went to Peterhof and stayed there for a week at the boyfriend's friend's house. Vanessa got a break and could move around the house more or less calmly and fulfill her duties with full dedication. The girl also saw the owners rarely and hardly ever encountered them in person. Alan, noting the responsibility of the staff, periodically made small changes in the staff or reassignment of duties. For example, Vanessa was assigned to clean the guest rooms and all those rooms where the owners were present. And although in this case the probability of crossing with them increased, the girl did not dare to disobey the manager. To avoid being accused of something terrible, Vanessa decided to tell Alan about what Ciara had done to her. "What was the reason?" the man asked after listening to her story. "I don't know. As far as I could tell, the guys didn't know either. It was just something she didn't like. And then she found all sorts of reasons to hate me more and more." "Well, she's gone now, so you can work in peace." "Well, she's gone. Besides, they're getting married in the fall, and then they're going on a honeymoon, after which she'll start school. She won't have time for you. She probably doesn't remember you." "How long has it been since you've seen her?" "A little over 3 years." At the mention of the upcoming wedding of her lover and former classmate, Vanessa's legs nearly gave out. She didn't think the happy event would happen so soon. "Don't worry. It's good that you warned me. Don't worry. How come you were in the same class as her?" Her dad was from the local government back then and wanted to show how close he was to the people, which didn't stop his daughter from showing us what dirt we are, basically. "Yeah, tough luck for you. But why have I learned to ignore people like Ciara? Like your mom?" The man's voice broke out involuntarily, but he didn't even seem to notice. "How do you know what my mom was like?" Vanessa was surprised. "You told me." It was obvious that Alan was embarrassed and didn't know what to say. Maybe he said at last. The next day, Vanessa met the owner of the house for the first time. She was cleaning the table of photos, humming her mother's favorite song. At that moment, David entered the room. "Jessica," he said involuntarily when he saw the girl. "No, I'm Vanessa. I'm sorry, I didn't know you'd be home at this time. Alan told us to do the cleaning in your absence." "That's okay. Go ahead and work. I won't interrupt you. You just remind me of someone I know. My mom's name was Jessica," David said unexpectedly. Vanessa continued working. At Alan's insistence, the staff tried not to engage in conversation with the owner. She didn't see the man's face change, as if he had seen a ghost in front of him. The next day, Alan told her that Chloe and the landlady were away on business, and in their absence she would be responsible for cleaning the owner's rooms. "Why me? I thought I was only allowed to clean the hallways and the living room." "It's David's personal order," Alan replied. It was obvious that he was not happy with this decision. Vanessa was not going to argue with her boss, so she went to clean David's room, assuming that he had already left for work. The huge apartment, furnished in classical style, decorated in gray pastel colors, reminded her of a trip to a museum. She spent a few minutes looking at the rich furnishings, which were different from what was in the rest of the house. That was why she did not immediately notice that her host had not left, but was sitting in a deep armchair by the window, apparently immersed in his thoughts. The girl's first impulse was to go out and return later. But at that moment the man raised his hand, in which he held an old photo from his seat. It was perfectly visible who was depicted on it. The black and white photo showed a happy couple standing, embraced on the seashore. The young man was David, only much younger by about 20 years. In the girl, Vanessa recognized her mother. It was the very photo she had found after her mom's funeral. Only in her mom's photo, the man was ripped off. Unable to restrain the first impulse, the girl said, "Where did you get a photo of my mom?" David flinched. He seemed to be so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't notice her entering. Quickly putting the photo away, he stood up and got ready to leave the room. "You didn't answer," Vanessa stopped him. "You made a mistake. That's me and my wife when we were young. My mom has the exact same photo, only you're torn off. And your wife is the same height as you. That's my petite mom in the photo. How do you know her?" Vanessa looked into the man's eyes. Many times she had read in books that in the eyes you can find the answer to all questions, and she had never understood how that was possible. Now, looking at the pain reflected in them, the girl realized what the man could not say out loud. "You're my father," she said. David took a deep breath and turned away from the window. Apparently, it was easier for him to talk that way. "Yes, but I didn't know Jessica had a baby for a long time. When we broke up, I had Alan keep an eye on her, watch her from afar, help her if she needed it. A year later, however, he told me he'd met Jessica. She absolutely refused any help or any mention of me at all. It turns out he didn't stop looking after you. When you were orphaned, he was the one who made sure you were placed in our home. And you didn't know about this?" "No, not until yesterday. He wanted to keep you close so you wouldn't get into trouble. He hoped I wouldn't recognize you. Basically, he had the right idea. We weren't planning on living in this house for long. The chances of us crossing paths were minimal. But why did you and Mom break up? Do you have any idea? I had a family, a kid, Jessica. And Jessica was just a temporary fling. A distraction from the family routine," the girl finished harshly. "No, you're wrong," David objected. "She was never just an infatuation for me. Not her. She and I met here in Chicago. She was visiting the museum, and I had business nearby. We bumped into each other, got to talking. Then walked around the city until midnight. I just lost my head so much that I sent my family overseas and flew on vacation with Jessica. She was so sweet, so pure, so light, so trusting. I was serious about divorcing Addison and marrying your mom. What stopped you from doing that?" "My father. When he found out what I was doing, he was quick to bring me back down to earth. Our business was completely dependent on Addison's father. If I'd left her, my father-in-law would have left us with nothing. At best. At worst, we'd be found somewhere out of town. And it wasn't just my life I was risking. Jessica wouldn't have survived either." I couldn't lie any further, so I told the truth. She was broken and crushed. In the end, she asked me to leave her and never come into her life again. I couldn't just let her disappear. I offered to move to Chicago so I could see her once in a while. "And what did she do? Did you know your mother well?" "She refused," Vanessa replied. "Of course she did. I haven't seen her since, but my father asked Alan to keep an eye on her. Well, you know the rest. I saw the deed to the apartment, so Alan gave it to me. I didn't realize who he was at the time. I see now. Maybe he didn't tell me about it. I didn't know about you until yesterday. I mean, the best person to ask is Alan, I guess. I was having a hard time with our breakup. I wanted to go to her and apologize, but suddenly I got the news that Matthew was very ill. I got on the same flight to see him. My father did everything he could to save Matthew, and I came back as late as possible. When I got back, Alan said Jessica was missing, and he couldn't find any trace of her. That's probably when you showed up, and that's how he kept you from me. Maybe he did the right thing. Knowing that my beloved had a child with me, I could hardly resist leaving everything for you. But you had a child in your family too." "Yes, I did," David said absently, and turned back to the window. Vanessa decided that the conversation was over and left the room quietly. As she was about to close the door, she realized and asked, "Can I continue working here?" "I won't say anything to anyone, I promise." "You're just like your mother. You're not a mercenary," David replied. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you can stay, but promise not to tell anyone about anything. If I may, it's going to be hard to explain now." Back in her room, Vanessa took a long time to come to her senses. The man she had never dreamed of meeting turned out to be her master, the owner of a huge fortune and family. Vanessa tried not to think about it at all. After all, now it turned out that she had fallen in love with her own brother for the first time. Now her love was not only unrequited, hopeless, but also criminal. Incestuous. She had to forbid herself to even think about it. The ideal would be to quit this house and forget this family like a bad dream. About demanding something from her father, the girl did not even think about it. After sitting in the room for about half an hour, Vanessa decided to find Alan and consult with him. Besides, she wanted to question him, because he almost certainly knew she was the owner's daughter when he invited her to work in his house. Besides, she hadn't fulfilled her duties. and she was used to working responsibly. Right now, though, the thing she wanted most was to pack her things and leave for her hometown. Probably my mother also decided almost 20 years ago, when she refused all the benefits offered by my father, refused to destroy his family. Although she herself with great difficulty was able to raise her daughter on her feet. Maybe that's why she left life so early? There was a knock at the door. Vanessa realized she'd been in the room for quite some time. Did they notice her absence? Alan was at the door. "We need to talk," he said, and gestured for her to follow him. Vanessa thought it would be about her and the fact that she had learned the secret of her birth. However, judging by how tense and even angry the man was, the girl guessed that something similar had happened. "What do you think you're doing?" Alan asked. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa feigned innocence. "And pretending to be an innocent fool. And pretending to be an innocent fool. She's making a spectacle of herself here, saying that Ciara might slander you, and she's hanging herself around Matthew's neck." "I didn't hang myself. I fell down the stairs, he caught me. And at 12 this afternoon, I've been bombarded with questions about who he is and where he's from. I don't know where he is or how he's acting. I was checking the dust in the closet. Standing on the stairs, he quietly walked in. I lost my balance, almost fell. That's the whole story of our interaction. I swear to you. Learn, girl. I won't allow you to interfere in the lives of family members." "You won't? Then why did you bring me here? Or are you telling me you didn't know who the owner was? Or didn't you buy my mom an apartment when I was born? Didn't you look after her? You didn't find me?" "It doesn't matter. I just have one question for you. Why?" Alan didn't seem to be so much taken aback by the news as by the fierce intensity with which she spoke. "How do you know everything?" he wondered. "You probably haven't noticed that I look remarkably like my mother, but my father did. Besides, I saw a photo of them together, so there's no reason for me to be messing around with my own brother." Still not recovered, the man sat down and was silent for a few minutes, as if gathering his thoughts and choosing words. Finally, he spoke. "Yes, I did buy the apartment for Jessica. Because David had done her an injustice. He had no right to leave her like that, like a tired toy. Not her. Pride wouldn't let her tell him about the baby. Pride wouldn't let her ask for money to support her. That's why I didn't tell him anything about you. He just had no right to know that he had a child. His baby is his own. His own. But he'd already had Matthew by then. Yeah, another baby. I fell in love with her, and I wanted her to be my wife. I'd raise you like a daughter, take care of you and mommy. But she loved your father and chose him again. Again. Don't you think there's too much you're leaving out?" Vanessa asked. "I don't need the whole truth. It doesn't concern me. Why did you bring me here?" "I wanted to keep you under supervision. I didn't think he'd recognize you. I didn't think he'd recognize you, that Matthew would be interested in you. You're just a child. You're not old enough to live on your own. That's why I found you, invited you to work here." "I can't stay here anymore," Vanessa said. "I'm sorry, but it's beyond me." "Why not? What's stopping you? Did David ask you to do this?" "No, he asked me not to tell anyone yet." "So stay here for now. I'll decide what's best." "Okay." While Vanessa was thinking of an answer, Alan got a call. "What? Where is he? Is he alive? What hospital is he in?" the man exclaimed. A moment later, he sprinted out of the room and rushed toward the service exit. Vanessa remained, not realizing what had happened. By late afternoon, it was learned that Matthew, while riding out of town in an automobile, had been involved in an accident. The likelihood that he would be alive was minimal. From the news, Vanessa could hardly stand on her feet. David rushed to see his son at the hospital. Alan was there too. The others had to wait to see if the young man would survive the night. By morning, it was reported that the boy needed a blood transfusion. And a few hours later, it became known that the injuries were much more serious than the doctors had decided the day before. A lot of blood was needed. In addition, the guy had a rather rare group, the 4th negative. In such a situation, the ideal donor could be someone close to him. Vanessa's first impulse was to offer herself as a donor, but her Rh factor was positive. She was surprised by this. She had known since high school that children inherited their father's Rh factor, so it had to be the same for her and Matthew. Meanwhile, the search for a suitable donor was unsuccessful, and time was literally counting by minutes. Close relatives and all those who were in the hospital at the time were checked for a match. Unexpectedly, Alan turned out to be a suitable donor candidate. No one paid any attention to it at the time. Everyone was alarmed by the guy's condition and was glad that he would live. Recovery took quite a long time. The young and healthy body was taking its toll despite the serious injuries. Chiara was sent back to England by her father so as not to upset her. Besides, the school year was starting and the girl was just beginning her studies. The wedding due to the accident had to be postponed. It seemed that neither the bride nor the groom was particularly upset by this news. At the end of August, Matthew was discharged from the hospital. Vanessa, who all this time tried not to show her father in front of her eyes and not to remember about her inappropriate feelings for her brother, realized that her idea to go home at the beginning of summer was the most reasonable. It turned out that Alan had interrogated her on the day of the accident for a reason. Matthew had shared his plans for Vanessa with him. The guy really fell in love and planned to leave the bride imposed by her father. He was not at all embarrassed by the fact that his beloved was a maid and that his father would be furious when he found out about everything. He decided to share his plans with someone he had grown accustomed to trusting since childhood. Uncle Alanonu, his father's assistant and longtime friend, had actually raised the boy. In many ways, Matthew trusted him much more, so he decided to confide his plans for his upcoming marriage to him as well. Trust him and ask for advice. Alan realized that the boy's youth and inexperience could ruin not only his life and career, but also hurt his father. In his first impulse, Alan wanted to send Vanessa back to her hometown. His plans were thwarted by an accident, and then he realized that he was doing to Matthew exactly the same thing his father had once done to David when he forced him to leave Jessica. However, he wasn't going to let their relationship go as far. Another naive, jilted girl and another unhappy child. No, that wasn't what Alan was going to allow. He made the decision to give them time to work things out. Maybe this relationship would work itself out. Or maybe there was no love affair, just a desire to go against his father's plans, so he decided not to get involved. Besides, it had been over 2 months, and the infatuation with the girl might have worn off in the young man's head. Unfortunately for him, Matthew not only did not forget about his infatuation with the young maid, but from the first day he decided to take active steps. And the first step was a huge bouquet, which Vanessa found under her door the next morning. There was no envelope with an indication of the giver, but it was not required. There were, and could be, no options. Vanessa decided to nip his advances in the bud. Entering the young man's room, she caught him warming up. After a month of forced bed rest and recovery from fractures, the guy decided to make up for lost time. His leg was still in a cast after a bad fracture, but he had already asked to have arm exercisers installed in the room. The moment Vanessa walked in, he was working out while listening to music through headphones. He couldn't hear her enter, and she froze, seeing him so perfect, so athletic. Apollo in a cast. Considering that she'd hardly had relationships or attention from guys before, she wanted to give in to his advances, if only for a short time, and then tell him everything, or silently disappear and live the rest of her life in happy memories. She must have been too deep in thought, because Matthew had noticed her presence and was saying something to her. I'm glad Vanessa seemed to have listened to the most important part of the conversation, considering how wide and happy the guy was smiling. I'm sorry, I was listening. What were you talking about? I was saying that I'm going to break up with her today and tell my dad. Tell him what? I guess I hit my head a little, Matthew joked. I couldn't help it, and I can hear you. I can't understand why you make decisions that affect me without asking my opinion. I thought you liked me too. There's a very, very, very big difference between liking you and running to the ends of the earth with you. But for example, you and I haven't met. I'm a maid. You're a millionaire's son. I'm a college graduate. You're a prestigious foreign university. You're rich and famous, I'm not. I wanted to finish, but she didn't dare. I don't see the problem. We've got plenty of time to get to know each other. How old are you? 19 soon. Great. Plenty of time to get a decent education. It's not like I'm dragging you to the wedding on your doorstep like Ciara and I did. Let's just be around each other and get to know each other. I like you a lot, and I can't believe you don't feel the same way about me." With those words, Matthew reached out his arms to her and gently pulled her to him. She should have resisted, should have turned away, should have pulled away and pushed him away. Great came a familiar voice. "I'm gone for a couple weeks, and he's already smirking. With some girl." A furious Ciara stood in the doorway, glaring at the couple. "Ciara, what are you doing here?" Matthew didn't seem bothered by the fact that he was kissing another girl in front of his fiancée. He didn't even open his arms, still holding Vanessa to his chest. "The same ones you did. You're so shameless. Now let her go. I don't know who you're hugging. It would have been nice if she was a famous model." "Stop," Ciara shouted, yanking Vanessa's arm away from Matthew. "I can't believe it. The maid. What are you doing here anyway? You haven't changed a bit. You're still the same ugly gray mouse." "Ciara, stop it." Matthew stood up for Vanessa, not surprised that the girls knew each other. "What are you, silent? Did you choke on your tongue as usual? What brings you here? Are you trying to get back at me? You sneak into my fiancé's house and get into bed with him. Don't get your hopes up, you won't get him." "Ciara, you're wrong," Vanessa tried to justify herself. "I took a job in this house, not knowing that it would soon be yours. I came to Matthew's room to see if he needed anything cleaned or brought in, and I accidentally fell on his lips. And he asked me to help him up out of his chair. I did." Ciara finished. "You've never been good at lying, but now you decided to try. Well, that's a ridiculous excuse to fall for." Anyway, she turned to her fiancé. "It's going to stop today, or else, well, she knows it will be otherwise." With that, the girl left the room, slamming the door so that a painting fell from the wall. The glass shattered into several dozen pieces, one of which bounced off and hurt Matthew's hand. "Damn, what a fury." He laughed, trying to pull the shard out of the wound. "Let me help," Vanessa said on impulse. But after a couple of minutes, Vanessa regretted it, because she found herself pressed against the door. The young man, not waiting for her to object, kissed her. Her legs gave out and she would have fallen if he hadn't put his arms around her. Gathering her will in a fist, she managed to pull away and say, "Don't ever do that again." "But you liked it, didn't you?" The guy grinned and reached for her for another kiss. This time Vanessa managed to dodge. "I have to clean this place up," she said, ducking out the door and trying to hide in her room as quickly as possible. After catching her breath, she went back to the kitchen, grabbed a dustpan and broom, and headed for Matthew's room. This time he was fully dressed and sitting in front of the TV. "Calm down? Let's continue. I'm here to clean up the glass," Vanessa said. "I hope you won't hurt your hand with anything else." "Not anymore. But you didn't remove that shard from me either. If you behave like this, it'll stay in your hand, and you'll let it," Matthew said mockingly. "And if it starts to get blood poisoning and I die without glory or honor?" The young man's voice was enveloping and made him think of anything but work. "No, I can't let David get blood poisoning," Vanessa said. "No, you can't. He was the only one with the right blood. He's had a lot of it pumped out of him. You were the same blood before. No one else had such a rare bloodline. Not even your parents," Vanessa blurted out. She was about to bite her tongue off for that last sentence, because Matthew clung to her like a bulldog. "What's weird, your parents don't have a band like mine. I misspoke. And anyway, I have to go. Or you're not going anywhere until you explain what you meant." Matthew's tone went from playful to affectionate to categorical, unapologetic. "I didn't mean anything. Except that children most often inherit their parents' Rh factor," Vanessa said hastily. "If I remember my biology course well. If a child has it negative, it means that he took it from his parents or one of them. So if my parents have it positive and I have it negative, I'm a foundling?" "No, why? Maybe your father's Rh factor is positive. Usually children inherit it from their father. But I'm not sure, I don't know. We should go to the hospital," she suggested. The boy seemed to understand everything and began to reason out loud. Alan's father is an acquaintance from childhood. They were friends. Alan devoted his whole life to sports, and his father went into business. When he was able to make good money, he invited Alan to become a personal security guard. Gradually, he took on other responsibilities such as running the house. Always together, always there for each other. Never a quarrel. And now Alan becomes the only suitable donor for me. Well, maybe you don't know and someone else helped? Vanessa suggested. There are all sorts of reasons why a person can't be a donor illnesses. For example, maybe your mom with the same rhesus. Vanessa regretted 100 times that she had voiced her doubts aloud. No, only Alan's Matthew cut her off. He seemed oblivious to the fact that Vanessa was still in the room. He gestured toward the door, signaling that she should leave the room. He picked up the phone from the table and dialed a familiar number. "You can come to my room. It's an emergency," the guy shouted after he heard an attempted objection. Going downstairs, Vanessa ran into Alan on the stairs, who was walking with quick steps towards Matthew's room. Finishing her business, the girl returned to her room and began packing. It was naive to believe that she was in a position to fight this. It had some incomprehensible magical power over her, making her lose her will and her mind. The consequences could be most unpredictable and terrible. So she should have left the house, returned to her own place, and thought about how to live further, how and what to earn money for. About demanding from her father financial help or his participation in her life. The girl did not even think about it. She wanted to forget this page of her life. No sooner had she packed her things than the phone rang. It was Alan. He asked her to come up to Matthew's room. His voice was calm but strange. "I told you not to go where you don't belong." Alan greeted her with those words as soon as she could enter. "Wait, don't scare her before she's ready. Maybe things can still work out very well." Matthew cheered up after talking to Alan, as if he had heard great news. "I don't understand what's going on," Vanessa said. "Alan, I wanted to ask you to pay me back. I can't stay here any longer. Of course, you've made a mess, and you're in the bushes." "No, darling, you're not going to do it now." "No, dear, you're not going anywhere now," Alan grinned. Matthew tried to grab the girl's hand. The attempt, however, was unsuccessful, and he fell back onto the bed where he had been sitting. Vanessa instinctively rushed over to him for support. "I told you she loves me too," Matthew laughed, standing up easily and hugging the girl. I see that history is repeating itself again. And your father will not be happy about this news." Alan shook his head. "Not to mention your fiancée and her father." "My fiancée is in front of you," Matthew objected. "Will someone please explain to me what's even going on here?" Vanessa pulled out of Matthew's embrace. She looked from one to the other, trying to figure out what they were hiding. "Alan, tell me. She knows half of this terrible secret anyway. Besides, she thinks she's in love with her brother. And don't argue, I can see that you like me," the guy said when the girl tried to get indignant. "Judy, sit down." "This is going to be a long conversation," Alan said. "David and I grew up in the same neighborhood. Ever since kindergarten, we've done every mischief together. Never fought. Always helping each other out. We lived like that for almost 10 years until a military family moved in next door. The incoming officer and his wife had a beautiful daughter, Addison. As you can imagine, that's Matthew's mom. We were both crazy about her, chasing her around like puppies. And we weren't the only ones. She was the star of the school within a year. Nobody even noticed her at first. And then we graduated and moved away. And we met at the New Year's Eve ball at school, not knowing what David had charmed her with. We had an affair. But I didn't want to give up either, even though I couldn't stand in the way of their happiness. So I finally confessed everything to her and gave her a choice." "She chose David?" Vanessa asked. "No, she did what a real woman would do. She stayed with one man and got pregnant by another," Matthew said angrily. "Don't you dare say that. It's your mother." Alan almost punched the young man in the face. "Matthew, stop it." "Alan, what happened next? Tell me." As crude as it sounds, Matthew expressed the essence of what happened, Alan said. "She did choose David, and she gave me a generous gift that I couldn't have hoped for on the last night. Who would have thought that was the night she'd get pregnant? Yeah. So that's why you have the same blood type? Vanessa guessed. Yeah, I've suspected that for a long time, Matthew said. I look a lot like you. The same habits. My father and I were always like strangers. When did you find out that Addison's baby was your son? When she and David set a wedding date, I decided to leave. Stay out of the way. I signed a contract and joined the army. Came back almost 6 years after I was wounded. No family, no money. David found me and invited me to stay with him. The first time I saw Matthew, I knew he was my son. I don't know how the others didn't see it. That's around the time David met Jessica. I thought to myself, this is my chance. Jessica's gonna leave, and I'm gonna marry Addison. And we'll all be happy, Alan said. Yeah, happy, Matthew queried. Did you forget that in the world of money, no one's happy? Yeah, you're right. And Addison had made it clear to me that she didn't want me. To be honest, I'd grown cold to her during the separation. So I helped David cover up the whole Jessica thing. I bought her an apartment while I looked after her. You fell in love? Vanessa asked. You sure did. We even have the same taste in women. Only Jessica remained faithful to her first, and only loved for the rest of her life. Yeah, Mom never looked at another man after that, Matthew confirmed. Well, it was a story that was gradually forgotten. David took his family abroad. I went with them. I lived in 2 countries. And when Jessica was gone, I decided to move Vanessa closer to me so I could keep an eye on her. Addison and his son decided to come back to America too? Vanessa guessed. And then you know the rest, my friends. I don't know how you fell in love, but this guy interrogated me today. I had to come clean. So you're Matthew's father? Vanessa asked. Does David know? No, I don't think so. Anyway, we've never talked about it. Yeah, it's a real passion, Vanessa shook her head. It's like a movie. It's better than that, Matthew grinned. Now, I don't know if my alleged father will send me away and bequeath all his millions to you. Matthew, stop it. It's not funny. That's not funny. It's only fair, really. And I won't have to marry you or your daughter. I mean, he doesn't need me to make family connections with his business partners. Hey, I'm a good sport about this. Hey, I'm a good sport about this. You're going to be a rich heiress, and I'm going to get you again. Then I'll have the money again. Matthew seemed to be enjoying the situation. I wouldn't be so happy if I were you, Vanessa said. I think we should keep it a secret. At least for now, Alan said. I mean, Dad, are you crazy? Where's the secrecy going to go from here? So for a quarter of a century, everyone was silent. And it's not like David hadn't guessed anything. I suggest we get everyone together at the family council and confess everything. Have a night of revelations, Matthew suggested. It turns out that both parents were dishonest, both cheated and both had children on the side. Yourself? Alan questioned. But in fact, I'm an illegitimate child too. I'm not sure everyone will be as thrilled, Vanessa replied. I'm sure we can't keep quiet, Matthew insisted. Let's do it this way. I'll tell David myself. And then we'll think about it. The 3 of them went about their business. And not knowing that the capricious and resentful Ciara had already complained to her father about her fiancé Matthew. The man had never been known for his gentle nature, being resentful and suspicious. The fact that his potential partner couldn't keep his son in line meant that he would be just as soft in business, and he didn't want to do business with such people. By the time Alan had persuaded Matthew and Vanessa to keep quiet and not tell anyone what they'd learned, Ciara's father had already ordered the withdrawal of his investments in all of David's projects. Breaking up the deals threatened to lose large sums of money. Not getting a clear answer from his subordinates, David went home in a frenzy to seek an answer from his son. And the first person he saw in Matthew's room was his newfound daughter Vanessa in his son's arms. How dare you? David screamed at Vanessa. Did you purposely show up to destroy my family? I will crush you to dust. And you, puppy, he said to Matthew, get dressed immediately and go to your fiancée. I don't care how, but you will beg her forgiveness. You'll restore the engagement. Her father will get his money back, invested in my business. And I'll deal with you later, he said to Vanessa. I wouldn't be in such a hurry, Matthew replied. Besides, you can't tell me what to do. I'm not even your subordinate, let alone anything more. What did you say? David was outraged. I'll take everything away from you. You'll forget what expensive cars and resorts look like, where you used to spend my money. I'm scared, Matthew replied calmly. I'm already educated. Thank you, I'm sure, but you can't take it away. But you can't take it away from me. I'll take care of the rest. You've never earned a penny in your life. You've never earned a penny in your life. Now you're showing a little attitude, David continued to shout. I'm a grown man. As soon as I'm in shape, I'll leave your apartment. What's the holdup? I can have the room today. I think it's rightfully yours for your child to occupy. Yes, Dad, Matthew said calmly. Or did you think that your little secret of having a daughter out of wedlock would remain a secret? David turned pale and sat back in his chair. He seemed suddenly short of breath. What makes you think that? He hissed. Oh, don't say that. I have the courage to confess. And bonus, you get one more little secret. But just in case you think I'm hugging my own sister, Matthew. What are you talking about? David shook his head. Yeah, so he didn't know. Well, Alan wanted to tell you, but I beat him to it. Tell me what? Dad, have you known this your whole life? Matthew stared at his father. Didn't you ever see anything in me in common with him? Even I had my doubts as a child, when he and I had common tastes and interests. That's impossible. Addison was faithful to me, David said stubbornly. By and large, yes. They had a little adventure with your friend before you got married. That's why he moved away, so that he wouldn't interfere with your happiness. You're wrong about what? That I'm his son? Matthew asked. I assure you I only found out today. Or rather, I guessed it, thanks to your clever and attentive daughter, Vanessa. It was in her bright head came the idea that the parents with a positive Rh factor, having the second type of blood, cannot have a child with the fourth negative. Genetics is a scary, stubborn, and surprisingly accurate in such matters. I checked. Vanessa was right. The fact that Alan was the only suitable donor only made her suspicious. And you should have warned us all, Matthew continued wryly. Why? Because you should have been in school, not skipping classes. Vanessa looked at Matthew and couldn't believe her own eyes. In just one morning, he had gone from a sweet and handsome boy to a tough and sarcastic one. He seemed to enjoy seeing the effect his words had on David. Meanwhile, the man was getting worse, as he unbuttoned his shirt collar and loosened the knot of his tie. From the change in his complexion, his condition was alarming. Matthew, stop it, Vanessa exclaimed. You can see he needs help. Grabbing the phone, she called an ambulance. Then she called Alan and David's driver. Together, they managed to carefully take the man downstairs to the exit, where the ambulance was already arriving. The girl decided to accompany her newfound father to the hospital. She instructed Alan to talk to Matthew so he wouldn't do anything stupid again. David was taken to the hospital just in time. On the background of high blood pressure and stress, he had a stroke. Fortunately, there were doctors nearby, which meant that it was hoped that the consequences would not be so devastating. The man stayed in hospital for about 2 weeks, after which there was a long period of rehabilitation. Vanessa lived between the hospital and home. Even though her father had received excellent care at the expensive hospital, she was terrified to even imagine that she could lose her last loved one, barely finding him. She'd only crossed paths with Matthew a couple times in all this time. He, too, seemed to have lost interest in her. As soon as the cast was removed from her leg, Matthew moved out of the house without telling her where he was going. Before he left, he contacted his mother, who was in Los Angeles, and warned her that she shouldn't show up at their new home yet, for her father had found out her little secret. Don't feel bad about it, Addison replied. He has one of his own. Suddenly, his illegitimate daughter, Ciara, had turned up and was now staying in his bed. He's probably already made her his sole heir. So you have no business in LA, Matthew said sharply. What daughter? What are you talking about? Matthew, your life with him has never been perfect, Addison replied. So I don't think you're surprised by this news. Besides, he's a man, and men have a tendency to have affairs on the side. At least, I understand him. Besides, it's not your place to complain about him. Hisham, how's he doing? He'll live. They got him to the hospital on time, and he's got the best doctors in the world. Have you been to see him? No, why? As it turns out, I'm nothing to him now. He raised you? Even if you didn't know he wasn't your father, he put all his heart, soul, love, and a lot of money into you. Is that what you're saying? That too. How can you be so callous? I'm not callous. I'm sober. There's no point in me staying there now, which is why I'm calling you so you don't accidentally show up. I'm on the next flight out. It's a shame your health and the lives of your family don't mean anything to you. I'm sorry. In spite of everything, your father and I have been together for over 20 years. It's up to you. Don't be surprised to find a new mistress at home. Let me handle this. The next day, the woman was in New York. She decided to come home later and went to the hospital right after the airport. Her husband's condition was indeed quite satisfactory. Still, a healthy and fairly young body was able to cope with such a test. In the corridor, Addison met Vanessa. Surprisingly, the girl seemed completely different from how her son had presented her. Even though they had a romantic relationship looming, David was resting after his treatments, so the woman decided to ask Vanessa about him. Vanessa talked about David's well-being and the doctor's prognosis. Somehow, imperceptibly, the conversation turned to who Vanessa really was. The girl told how she herself had found out that her master was her father. How Matthew had guessed that Alan was his father. In fact, they hadn't noticed how they had talked for hours, sitting in the quiet hospital cafe. After talking to the girl, Addison went to her husband's room and Vanessa went home. She was to give the order to prepare a room for the mistress. Lately, she had taken over the housekeeper's duties and was doing a fine job with them. Alan was away on a business trip. Addison came home in the evening and was pleasantly surprised to see that they had prepared for her arrival. She said that they had discussed things with her husband calmly without mutual complaints or recriminations. In the end, they came to the conclusion that they would keep the family together, because many years had passed since their transgressions. Matthew David promised to help with his own business, and Vanessa to send to study. Now it was their mutual children. Besides, Vanessa had no one else but them. Sometimes life presents us with serious tests of willpower, kindness, loyalty, humanity. It is important not only to deal with the problem, but also to understand and learn the lesson. And the most important thing is to remain human in any situation. Vanessa was lucky. Life compensated her for the most difficult loss with several new acquisitions: family, prospects, opportunities, study. And although no one and nothing could replace her mother, now she could rely on her father. It was always covered with a kise, this mirror, like a dead man in the house. If you came very close, you could see your reflection under the light-thin cloth. In general features, but 3 times a year, when the kise was removed to wash it, before New Year's Eve, Easter, and the first day of fall. The woman who did it tried to turn away or lower her eyes, so as not to glance inadvertently at the mirror. Shortly before her grandmother died, Anastasia received a letter from her. "Come. The house is yours now. Remember about..." And then there was the drawing so familiar, the frame, and of course the mirror. What the hell? Anastasia had no intention of coming before, as her mother had done in her time. She was the first to flee the old house for good, breaking tradition. When the eldest in the family died, the next one took her place. The words home and clan had always been synonymous in their family. The house was built by my great-grandfather to a certain extent. The only important thing is that the house was born in the 18th century, and before it stood in a large village on a hill by the river. Then with time the river became shallow. A dam was built above, and now it was necessary to go down and walk far to the water, and the village was gone, and the town crawled close to the house and was already licking its eyes at the old building, already sending people to buy it for nothing and then tear it down. And don't be such a steely character of grandmother. In a word, all those who rolled their lips had to admit, yes, the monument of culture and the house itself and the garden around it with arches, arbors, grottos, and fountains, too. Well, the mistress is an old woman, so we just have to wait. Her grandmother knew that she could not bequeath her estate to her daughter. She shivered at the mere memory of the house, with its traditions, silence, and things that gave her goosebumps. She ran away from it, as they say, with lard on her heels. In the end, my grandmother called Anastasia, and she came. She didn't intend to leave Paris, didn't want to return to Russia at all, but everything coincided. Her husband's betrayal, a long and painful divorce, her life shattered into shards, and Anastasia packed her bags. She knew what she was doing. The house demanded a renunciation of everything else. Serving it was becoming the main meaning of life. So in essence, in the state she was in, she had two options: to kill herself, or to stretch the process out over time, to let the house do it. Anastasia chose the latter. But now, 20 years later, she knew that her ministry was over because she had no children, and everything would be over with her. Those who would come here later might want to turn the house into a hotel or a museum, enchanted by its antiquity. The weather vanes on the turrets, the stained glass windows, the carved doors, and the black stone slabs. But the house won't allow it. And when the new owners realize this, having suffered 33 misfortunes, they will simply tear down every last bench, and there would be a wasteland instead of a house, a blank page of sorts. Anastasia hesitated further, though. Maybe the strength of the house is not in itself, but in the place on which it stands, and no matter what they built instead. And then Anastasia had a dream and realized it was too soon to despair. The one she wanted would be here soon. Only the dream was strange. Anastasia wasn't supposed to tell anyone about the new mistress of the house. But even if she did, there was no assurance that life would be as peaceful as before. The house had a premonition of something. It's still vague. That fall, my mother decided that they would winter at the dacha. Mom adored the dacha and the places around it. In general, it was a privileged place. It was a peninsula near the dam, which used to be a real island before it was built. One side were locks, motor ships, barges, yachts. On the other side was the river and the mountains behind it. My mother was once lucky enough to buy a plot of land and a dilapidated house cheaply from a woman who was leaving in a hurry, and she had to get everything done one day. Since then, from early spring to late fall, my mother worked here with enthusiasm. Every spare, and even not quite a spare rubble, went to work. But now there was a 2-story house, and the flowers delighted my soul until the snow came. In November, my mother always said goodbye to the dacha with regret, as if it were a living person. She walked around the house, stroked the walls, patted the door as if it were her own shoulder, and promised that in April there would be a new meeting. And this time she said, "You know what I'm going to do, Maggie? I'm going to winterize this place for you and me." Basically, the idea wasn't so crazy. Mom only needed the internet to work. The cottage had a great stove and several electric goats, so no one would freeze. The only thing was that almost all the dacha owners were leaving, and the store they had here was closed until the next warm season. "It's okay," Mom said. "I'll go grocery shopping once a week on a donkey." Donkey, she called their old car. "Well, you'll have to put up with your girlfriends," my mom continued. "You'll go to daycare for 2 days anyway, and then you'll be sick for 2 weeks. You don't get cold so easily. You're a hardened little man, but all these viruses." So they stayed and wintered well. Maggie didn't even notice the loneliness. It turned out to be happiness not to rush to kindergarten in the morning, but to lie in bed and look at the drawings on the carpet. Her eyes transformed geometric lines into fairy tale characters. Outside the window, it was slowly getting light. The outlines of trees were coming through. My mother was calling for breakfast. And the air was dizzyingly clear. The smell of strong coffee thickened, became palpable. The golden, sunny circles of scrambled eggs my mother sprinkled with green onions that grew on the windowsill, and the slight burning of its taste was a premonition of And on New Year's Eve, the two of them hung twinkling curtains of garlands in the garden, and everything sparkled and shimmered like a fairy tale. But then, as if they had conspired, they turned off the unnecessary light, and then the stars shone brightly in the sky, and the thin sickle of the month promised them riches in the coming year. They only had to show him the silver money. They didn't go inside for a long time, mesmerized by the beauty of nature, and only when they were completely frozen did they come back to sit by the fireplace. Her mother brewed some willow tea, which grew in the neighborhood in summer, and she kept Maggie awake, telling her witch tales for a long time because New Year's Eve was a special night, and it was not supposed to be the night for sleeping. January, with its many festivities, slipped by, and in February the snow began to drizzle, and Mom made friends with the snow shovel, because otherwise they would have been prisoners of the cottage, unable even to reach the driveway. In March, near the spring, Maggie found the first flowers of the mother nephew, and in April, trouble came. Then they said it had never happened before and would never happen again. An accident at the dam, the one that rose above their peninsula. Dacha dwellers always waited for spring with apprehension. The hydroelectric power plant began to release water, and the amount of water it would release depended on whether it would flood the neighboring small islands, and whether the water would reach the houses and cellars. This rarely happened, and when everything dried up, the dacha owners had to start repairs. It was believed that the dam had a safety margin for generations to come, but no one could have predicted that there would be heavy rains in the upper reaches of the river, and the snow would melt so rapidly, and the hour would come when all the gates would be open, and the water would rush over the top, flooding everything around. The evenings were already long, spring evenings, and Maggie had gotten out of the garden unauthorized. It was a loophole she could not see from the house. She was going to look at the river water always fascinated her, and at this time, when it was swirling and foaming near the dam, when flakes of foam were carried by the current, especially at this time. So at this time she found herself at the water's edge. Perhaps if she had been older and looked to her right, she would have had enough sense to realize what was happening and had a couple of minutes to rush to the higher ground. But she didn't realize, didn't notice, didn't understand. And when the water surrounded her, picked her up and carried her, she was saved only by the fact that she knew how to swim. Of course, in the icy river she would not have lasted 10 minutes, but next to her was the river's spoils, logs, planks, all sorts of junk. And you cover, maybe from someone's cellar, which became like a raft for her. There could not yet be any help. Those people who had just seen the flood were still recovering or calling any emergency services. And the water was so cold and the wind so scalding, when darkness began to fall before her eyes, Maggie only had time to wonder, could night come so suddenly? She felt sick. It was very hard to breathe. It was as if there was not enough air in the air. Someone's hand lifted her up and held her upright, but Maggie couldn't even hold her head up straight. It kept falling on her chest. "Have a drink," said the woman's soft voice. She tucked pillows under Maggie's back, made her comfortable, and sat down on the edge of the bed herself. "We have to move around a little bit, or we'll get congestion in the lungs. You have to finish this one." Every last drop. It was very difficult, because after each sip, Maggie fell asleep, or more accurately, fell into oblivion. In the end, the woman took pity on her and let her lie down as before and didn't bother anymore. But from that day, the first time Maggie drank from the cup, she began to recover. Now, every now and then she woke up, looking at the objects around her and the woman who came toward her as soon as Maggie opened her eyes. She was tall, very thin, wearing a billowing dark dress. Her hair was combed smoothly into a knot. Her face was so stern that she seemed incapable of smiling. But sometimes she did smile, and when Maggie asked for food, she blossomed. She brought an egg on a little tray, some breadcrumbs, a cup of tea, and she started spoon-feeding Maggie. She put a breadcrumb on the spoon, dipped it in the yolk, and brought it to her. "Come on, come on." Maggie felt that her teeth were soft, not even strong enough to chew dry bread. Still, her strength was returning, albeit slowly. The first question Maggie dared to ask, "Well, where's Mom? Where's Mom?" The girl didn't ask, neither what had happened, nor she was now. If her mother were around, none of this would matter. The woman brought her a newspaper. Maggie wanted to say that she could read only a little, and then only when the words were printed in big letters, and preferably those words should be short. But the woman did not suggest that she read. Then she unfolded the paper and showed her the pictures. There were many of them, and one was worse than the other. Maggie didn't recognize her dacha village. It had turned into a garbage dump. Ruined, mangled houses, puddles of water everywhere. "Mom," she asked pitifully. Lemon shook her head. It could only mean one thing. Mommy was gone. 6-year-old Maggie experienced such an acute sense of loneliness that it took her breath away. It was worse than when she was choking on pneumonia. Not only was it hard to breathe, but now she didn't want to live. "My name is Anastasia," the woman said. "You won't be alone, don't be afraid. You will be with me." It was a few more weeks until Maggie began to wander around the house, familiarizing herself with it. At first, she had to cling to the furniture out of weakness, but the faster her strength returned, the farther she traveled, exploring her new possessions. She liked the second floor best, a sunlit corridor with a view of the garden. Maggie opened the doors of the rooms one by one, and in each one she found a treasure. There was a piano, an ancient one, with candelabras and candles. There, a carpet, which was like a painting. A Turk in a turban was looking into a gazebo, where a beautiful girl was lounging on a sofa. Blessed that one of the doors was locked. The key was sticking out, though, and Maggie turned it carefully. She didn't expect to be able to handle the lock at all, but the key turned easily, and Maggie entered the room. It was almost empty. At any rate, the furnishings were most ascetic. A desk over which hung an old black radio, a stiff chair in which it must be very uncomfortable to sit, and Maggie thought it was the bride's veil, white, thin, on the wall. She touched it and heard a warning voice. Don't bother him unnecessarily." The girl recoiled. Instinctively, she realized that she had done something unauthorized and would probably be scolded. The key in the door was there for a reason. Of course, it was not allowed to come in. Still, she couldn't resist asking, "What's in there?" Anastasia lifted the edge of the kersey, turned it slightly away. Maggie saw the carved wooden frame. The wood had long since darkened. The frame was very old. "The less you talk to that mirror, the better." Anastasia didn't scold her. Her voice sounded trusting. "Anyway, it'll all be yours later, and you'll understand. In the meantime, don't come in here anymore, okay?" She wasn't ordering, she was asking. And Maggie nodded in agreement. "There's plenty of other rooms in this house to run around in, and walk as much as you like in the garden. But wait here, don't come here." Anastasia locked the door with the key and put it in her pocket. But not once since that day had Maggie even tried to break the ban. When she was older, though, it would have been easy to get to the room, like climbing that tree that grew under the window. But Anastasia didn't go there herself, and so there was nothing particularly interesting to see. The world that existed for Maggie now was limited to the house and the huge garden, surrounded by a high stone fence. She wasn't bored. It really was a whole world. A special man came to tend the garden, and it was always beautiful. Lots of secluded corners where you could hide from prying eyes, if there were any, and a little pond where you could feed the fish in the summer, and a swing, as if it were just for Maggie. Lots of roses, even green ones. The gardener was an old man, and he often stopped work to rest. At such times, Maggie would sit beside him, and he would tell her stories. She was especially fond of animal stories because the gardener gave the animals an almost human mind, and ordinary-seeming incidents turned into real tales. A cow and a pig conspiring to go to a faraway land, a dog performing real feats to save his owners. Maggie's eyes lit up. She would never leave Stephen Swan's side. In the long fall and winter evenings, Anastasia taught the girl various magic tricks. Modern people no longer spend time on this. Magic tricks belong in the circus. But Maggie had deft hands and a sharp memory. They started with different card games, like the simplest one, when one person chose a card and returned it to the deck, and the second had to guess what card is conceived. Then Anastasia started to show how to make an object disappear in your hands. There it was, and it's gone. "There's the mirror for tricks, too," Maggie asked. "You know, the one in the closed room?" "Do you know about the crooked mirrors?" Anastasia asked. Maggie shook her head. She had not had time to see this generally antiquated amusement. Like all girls, she played dolls, and the simplest games on a tablet. "Then I'll show them to you first," Anastasia said. "And then we'll talk about what you want to know." From time to time, they made outings. Anastasia realized that it wasn't entirely safe. What if someone she knew asked her about the girl? Or if someone from Maggie's former life recognized her? The search for those who had died in the flood had long since ended, and Maggie was numbered among them. If it had turned up otherwise, Anastasia would have gone to jail. It wouldn't have saved her from joining the angels if she hadn't pulled her out of the water. But Anastasia took the risk, and every now and then, of going out on the town with the girl, always away from where she lived, always for a little while. And when she and Maggie returned, both of them always felt the strangest feelings. When they opened the gate, it was as if they were stepping from the present into a past where roses bloomed and swings swayed quietly, where the fast, nervous 21st century had no entrance. Anastasia drove a machine that was older than herself. But Maggie was cared for like a living thing, and she still lived, and she drove them leisurely to wherever they wanted to go. This time they went to the park. It was not a work of designer art, but an old amusement park in the suburbs, a kind of excursion. Young people, like birds on perches, sat on the backs of benches, putting their feet on the seats. Along the alleys, the kids were taken on a mini steam train with tiny open cars. There were Devil's Wheel and Daisy and Illusion, in which it seemed that you were turning upside down and the ceiling, which should be at the top, was floating under you. The room of crooked mirrors was not popular and was empty. A full-figured woman, the one checking tickets, was bored beside her. Maggie instinctively sensed that Anastasia attached great importance to mirrors, so she squeezed her older friend's hand tight and asserted in vain. There was not a single person inside. Sunlight poured through the small windows in the ceiling, and dust flecks danced in it. Mirrors stood in a row, and Maggie moved from one to the other, watching her face and body change as they stretched, widened, and undulated. It was amusing, but no more. Maybe if the boys had been in Maggie's place, they would have laughed and pointed fingers at their supposed ugliness. But it took more than that to make Maggie laugh. The girl turned back to Anastasia and looked up at her, questioning. "It'll make more sense to you now," Anastasia said demurely. "In the meantime, let's go." They spent another hour or so in the park. They rode up on the Ferris wheel. Maggie felt as if the wind that ruled the city could pick her up and carry her as easily as it carried the painted autumn leaves. At an outdoor cafe, they ordered large portions of milkshake, Maggie a strawberry, Anastasia a chocolate. It was fun to dip the straw into the lush foam. In short, it was a wonderful day. And when they got home, Maggie never mentioned the mysterious mirror. In fact, she had forgotten all about it. She had enough to do besides. She was tired and slept so soundly that she didn't seem to move once during the night that she realized in the morning that her back and neck were stiff. However, after breakfast was over, Anastasia told her herself, "My DPHMs." Maggie realized what it meant and jumped up eagerly. When they reached the door that she had not opened since that one time, Anastasia unlocked it, took the key out of the keyhole, and put it in her pocket. "I won't lock it again." They stood at the mirror. Anastasia hesitated a little and, lifting the keyhole, threw it over the top of the frame. It was a rather large mirror, allowing me to see myself full length. It was a little tarnished from time, but otherwise it looked quite ordinary. The frame was the only good thing about it, the carvings so finely carved they were uncommon nowadays. A real weave of wooden lace. Maggie hesitated for a moment. She didn't understand why. She began, eventually, but she stopped her. "Look at our reflections," she said. Maggie began to gaze. Of course, her gaze was fixed on herself. After a while, she began to think that the girl reflected in the glass was more beautiful than she was. She had unusually smooth skin, and it was as if she had a slight gold cast to her skin. Maggie's features hadn't changed. It was undeniably her, but there were accents. There was a strength in her gaze that had never been felt before, and her whole appearance had taken on a marvelous harmony. It was hard for Maggie to take her eyes off her reflection. That girl in the glass was so good. She shifted her gaze to Anastasia's reflection and almost gasped. The simple face had turned into a countenance. A thin nose, perfectly shaped eyes, but there was no color in that face. It was waxy. Mirrors would do better if they reflected more. Or thought, Anastasia said thoughtfully. It's a French poet's phrase. It can be translated either way. Now look at this. She stepped back to the desk, where a chocolate-colored plush album lay on the table. Anastasia flipped through the pages and pulled out a photograph of a rather handsome middle-aged man. She turned the picture over so that the mirror would reflect it. A few moments passed and the man's face changed. His cheeks pulled back and sagged slightly, his lips curved, his gaze became different. It was the same man, but now his face was a complete reflection of his character. Overbearing, self-centered, intolerant. "That's my ex-husband," Anastasia explained. "Oh, but how does a mirror do that?" Maggie was amazed. "I don't know." Anastasia replied simply, "In my memory, it's always been there. Maybe it's older than this house. Maybe my great-great-great. I don't know how many times great-great-grandfather brought it from somewhere. But when you look at it, you start to see the real you. You can't hide anything from him. There are no secret movements of the soul for him. And I can't even tell if it will stay that way if you take it out of the house, or if it's the other way around if this place gives it its power. But there are two things you need to know that I will tell you. First of all, you can't take it out in public. It'll all be over at once. People will rush like vultures to investigate it, refute its power. Some will admire it, others will laugh at it, and it won't stand for that. That's why I showed you the crooked mirrors. If someone sees it by your carelessness, try to defend the mirror, say that it's just crooked, a toy for the public. and hide it the first chance you get. Secondly, avoid looking at him too much yourself. The longer you stare at him, the more power will bind you. What will happen to you? It's hard for me to describe. One time, when I was looking at the mirror for a long time, it was as if something from it was transmitted to me. After that, when I looked at people, I could read their minds. I thought I was going crazy. I hung up the mirror as before and hardly ever went into that room, and gradually it went away, but it was scary to feel such power. It is not given to man, and he must not trespass on it. Maggie looked around with the directness of a child. And all the things in here are magical, right? The table and the chair. Anastasia grinned slightly. What magic? It's something that really exists, but we can't yet understand it or explain it. The table and chair are just ordinary. Only this, she tapped her finger on the radio, is a funny thing. It looked like a very ordinary, primitive device. Black plastic on the back, and the front part was white, slightly dusty. A frequency scale, a white wheel. I wouldn't turn it on, Anastasia said. Mo, with it, you never know what you might hear. Most of the time, it's just noise interference. If you rotate the dial slowly, you can get to a popular song or news, but sometimes voices begin to sound. Sometimes surprisingly clear, you can even hear the speaker's breathing, as if he approached from the other side and whispers in your ear. Sometimes the voice is distant, and it's not easy to distinguish the words, but it's always people who are no longer in the world. You know, there are things like dreams or warning dreams. This is kind of like that. And you don't just hear it, you have to interpret it correctly. Radio is a thing that should not fall into the wrong hands. Can I? Maggie's lips quivered. Can I hear my mom through him? Anastasia looked at her strangely. Baby, it's never by choice. It's always random. You don't get an answer to your direct question. At least I've never been able to do that. Well, let's give it a try. Maggie was ready to beg. Anastasia sighed and stuck the plug into the socket. Maggie's nerves were so excited that she flinched violently as soon as the receiver came to life and hissed. Anastasia spun the time-darkened wheel slowly, lightly touching it with her index. Weather report, wheezing again, an old song about a truck driver wheezing, whistling noise, some sort of prize draw show, the deliberately animated voice of the host, failure, complete silence, and then a cold voice devoid of any intonation said, Metro. Now, Anastasia was already flinching. I don't think we'll hear anything more today, she said, but Maggie knew she would obey Anastasia and not disturb the mirror again. But if this room was not locked, she would sneak in from time to time and touch the wheel, move it a millimeter at a time, a fraction of a millimeter at a time, hoping that she might hear her own voice, that she might be able to send word, and not once did it happen. At first, Maggie found an opportunity to come here every day, if only for a few minutes. Then, frustrated and disappointed, she opened the door once a week, no more often. Songs replaced the news, sometimes bird song, sometimes a measured noise, as if there were a sea on the other side. And rarely, there were strange, ragged words spoken in a foreign voice. Words that Maggie didn't think had anything to do with her. Eventually, it became a tradition for her to come here 3 times a year. On her birthday, on her mother's birthday, and on the anniversary of the day the water washed away what had been their peninsula, took away all her former life. Not only did Anastasia keep Maggie out of school, she tried to make sure as few people as possible knew the girl lived here. Anastasia started teaching Maggie on her own. She did it responsibly. Textbooks and the internet were helpful. She had to scribble down a lot of penmanship before she developed a beautiful handwriting. How many books had to be read before reading became a necessity for Maggie? She taught her French for fun, and so she wouldn't forget the language she said. And by the age of 16, Maggie was already fluent in 2 languages, almost mastered the high school curriculum. Oh, math, what a torture you are. Razor blade and the intricacies of gardening were not forgotten in tricks. Here the girl's abilities were undoubted, at least in the circus, to perform. Shortly before her death, Anastasia gave her one last gift. She went down quickly and unexpectedly to everyone. Anastasia had always been thin and never had a blush on her cheeks, but it seemed to Maggie that her older friend was as eternal as this house. She couldn't imagine her life without Anastasia, and the woman had never caught a cold in her memory. How had she gotten pneumonia without ever having been anywhere without freezing? But Anastasia came down with it all at once, in one day, and with the same fidelity as a beast senses the approach of the end, she realized everything about herself. Once a doctor was called to the house for once. and he administered treatment without anticipating a bad outcome, without even talking about a hospital. But Anastasia told Maggie, who was caring for her, "Sit down, I want to have a serious talk with you." Maggie was frightened. She'd seen that look on Anastasia's face only once before she'd taken her to the secret room. She noticed that there were folders on the chair next to the bed. Apparently, the sick woman had somehow made it to the closet where she kept documents and other important papers. "I blame you," Anastasia said. "I raised you like a Mowgli. And I'll tell you, because you can't lie to me anymore, that I did it not so much for you as for myself. I don't know how your life would have turned out, but if you'd been orphaned, I don't think they would have given you to me. There's so much paperwork, a line of people who want to take a child into a family. If I'm orphaned," Maggie repeated slowly, separating one word from the other. Anastasia nodded. "I forbade myself to learn anything about the fate of the flood victims. You were sent to me as a sign from above. At least, that's how I understood it. I don't have children, and this house should go from my hands to other loving hands. That's why when you came here, I was as quiet as a mouse under a broomstick, and you and I began to lead such a reclusive life. Tell me, honestly." Anastasia touched the girl's hand with her thin and this time very hot fingers. "Have you felt bad with me all these years?" But Maggie was in a state of complete confusion. What if her family was alive, and her mom was alive? Was that why she had never heard her mom's voice on the radio of the dead? Anastasia interpreted her silence in her own way. "I understand," she said. "Just know that I loved you very, very much. Like the daughter I never had. Okay, there's no time for feelings, so let's get down to business." Maggie couldn't help but hear Anastasia's heavy breathing. It was as if the woman was short of breath. Later, Anastasia, she didn't notice that it was the first time she had called her older friend so affectionately. "Don't do it now. You don't have the strength to talk." "There's no later. Look at this." Anastasia untied the first folder. "These are your documents. I paid a lot of money for them, and I don't think anyone will question their authenticity. But if you want to, if life works out that way, you can get real ones someday. In the meantime, here's your passport, which says you're Taylor Maggie, your high school diploma. We're almost through high school. In short, these are the first things you'll need. This is my will, and I give you this house. When I die, it will take effect. Next is a bank card. Don't lose it. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to get you by. There's a PIN code written on the envelope. You must memorize it." And this Anastasia put the last folder in Maggie's hands. "This is sort of an emergency airfield, the little apartment where I lived before I got married. Now it's yours. In case something happens to the house, they take it away from you, you'll still have a roof over your head. You don't have to take anything from here then, just two things. You know what they are." Anastasia leaned back on the pillows and took a few minutes, covering her eyes, trying to regain her breath. "And not to frighten you, but I must tell you about it too. Don't worry about the funeral. Our gardener will take care of everything. Your business is to enter your rights as an heiress as soon as possible. It shouldn't be too difficult. I have no other relatives." For the first time in Maggie's memory, Anastasia was wrong. At first, however, she didn't care about that. Left alone, she felt a real, great grief, perhaps even greater than when she'd lost her mother as a child. Anastasia had been her whole world, and now that world was dead. Maggie really didn't have to worry about anything herself. All the trouble of the funeral was taken care of by others, both the old gardener and the staff of the bureau. The funeral service was held in the farewell hall. Maggie realized that Anastasia didn't want to let any extra people into the house even after she died. There was a tired, stern face in her coffin, and it seemed to Maggie that now Anastasia was listening to someone, to them, the living, invisible, and what he was saying she did not like. To the girl's deep sorrow was joined also anxiety. And when Maggie went back to the house where she had spent most of her life, it seemed vast, desolate, and gloomy, a veritable crypt. Never before had it evoked such associations. Fleshing what Anastasia had feared began almost immediately. Someone was keeping a close eye on the old manor, and they weren't about to let it fall into the hands of a young owner. Red subway came up again. The very first word she had heard on the old radio. The city was about to build new subway lines. In this connection, people living in old houses were decided to be resettled. They said that these buildings would not withstand the underground works. But one could not think that prestigious places in the center would be empty. They would be sold at a triple price. The houses would be demolished and replaced by company offices and shopping centers. The settlers will be sent to the suburbs. They're going to build economy class high-rises especially for them. and the mansion where Maggie lived fell into one of the new neighborhoods planned for construction. She was a pain in the ass. Maybe there are some states in the world where old houses whose owners don't want to give in to change are left alone, and new freeways circle them, and neighboring huts with futuristic buildings. But this was clearly not the case here, and Maggie began to receive commissions which could not be prevented the more these people behaved in a hostile manner. And the end of land committee inspector, a skinny tall man with a small bird's head of some kind, told Maggie, "You will be compensated. The cadastral value of this house is not very high." He mentioned a ridiculous amount. "You can, of course, sue, but you will only lose time." "You mean they'll take the house away from me?" Maggie asked naively. Her interlocutor shied away from answering. "You should look for a new place to live," he said. "You realize that the urban development plan has to be fulfilled." Maggie didn't listen any further, but the gardener told her that evening that there were rumors that the authorities had other plans. "It's a very nice house. You can't find a house that old nowadays. They'll tell Maggie it's not a cultural monument, or maybe they won't even make any excuses at all. A lonely girl, and a quiet, shy one at that, is no match for them. And here, it seems, they're going to make a hotel. A river nearby, a small park in the garden. Old windows will be replaced by plastic ones." Maggie even shook her head, imagining this picture. And even before she started the fight, she realized she was going to look. People came every day now. They seemed to have things to do, some to sign, some to clarify. But Maggie knew they wanted to see the inside of the house. Anastasia wouldn't let anyone in to see if there was anything to eat. "You won't sell these chairs?" asked the visitor. And the statuettes? A vase? Thanks a lot. It is unlikely that you will buy yourself such a large apartment to fit in it all the good, and in the antique store to drag far in troubles. Let's give you a good price right away. Maggie didn't have a shred of commercial savvy, and she still didn't consider herself an antique owner. Anastasia was. There was only one thing Maggie felt responsible for, and that was to remove what was in the secret room. She still hadn't let anyone else in here, though there had been people who wanted to. "What have you got in there?" Another guest pressed the doorknob seemingly casually. "Nothing. My personal belongings," and Maggie touched her fingers to reassure herself, touching the key that was now always in her pocket. And then the guy from the land committee told her that the will was invalid for some reason, so the house would go to the state and Maggie would not be compensated. The girl only looked at him with big, frightened eyes. She was completely defenseless, and the official named Bonds understood it. "No. So you can only bring your personal belongings with you," he said. Maggie realized that she might not be allowed to take the mirror out of the house. After all, its frame, its wooden lace, was a work of art, and someone might want it. She ordered a new frame, the simplest, made of pine. When it arrived and the gardener brought it into the room, Maggie would not let him do any more work. "I'll do it myself." She stood in the doorway, not realizing that she was like a nurse, that no one was allowed to care for a contagious patient. If there were going to be consequences, it would be for her alone. Maggie walked over to the mirror, sighed deeply, and tugged a cloth off. She'd been at it all night, either consulting the internet or despairing at her own clumsiness. In doing so, she was careful not to even casually glance at the glass itself. The mirror seemed to her to be the judge, from whom it was impossible to hide anything, and she was afraid to see herself with a face contorted with confusion and fear. But it was impossible not to touch the mirror, impossible to move away from it, and Maggie began to feel something happening inside her. Sounds became especially distinct. She could hear a mouse scratching somewhere far away in the house. Ladies, and the colors became clear and bright. The dawn appeared in all its splendor as she stretched out her legs, which were already aching mercilessly. Maggie walked to the window and froze, thinking that she had never seen such beauty. The shimmering colors of the rising sun. The birds singing. Maggie covered her face with her hands. She thought she couldn't stand it all, that she was going crazy, but there was one last thing left. She carefully set aside the disassembled old frame, wrapped the mirror in rough paper, tied it with strings. She hid an unattractive black and white radio in a bag. As she approached the door, she already knew that the gardener was going up to the second floor, and that he was not pleased with the way she had hesitated. That's it, he wondered, looking at what she was about to leave the house with. A wheeled bag with stuff, a small purse with documents, a plastic bag with something, apparently light in weight, and a mirror which no one could touch now. Just an old glass. That's it, Maggie confirmed. Can you please call me a cab? Here's the address. She had never been in the apartment, the keys to which Anastasia had given her not long before the end. Truth be told, Maggie was in such shock that now she didn't care where she lived. "She'll stay here," she said to the gardener. "You will tell them that I have vacated the house. I am gone." She waved her hands, and again the gesture was helpless. Maggie could easily read the gardener's thoughts. "I could take something from here for myself. There's money to be made for antiques." "Take it," Maggie said, as a memento of Anastasia. "You were good to her, and your garden was so beautiful." She ran down the stairs, leaving the man standing with his mouth ajar. First, the ride was across town. Maggie settled into the back seat and supported Mirror carefully, like a child. She didn't want the cabbie to help her carry her things in, though he offered. The worst thing was that the apartment was a one-room apartment. I mean, no meters didn't matter to Maggie, but to live with a mirror in one room. Then she saw a built-in closet in the hallway, and with a sigh of relief, she placed her burden there. Didn't even unfold the paper. Then she closed the closet and put a hook on top to make sure. Anastasia hadn't rented the apartment to tenants. No one had been in here in a long time, and the air was stale. It smelled like dust, if dust could have an odor. Or was it Maggie's sensitivity now, like a sheepdog? The girl opened the shutters and only now began to look around. It was the most ordinary apartment, and the current aesthetes would undoubtedly call it murdered. Wallpaper and floral in the room, furniture from the 20th century, a wall unit, and a few crystal vases, a sofa covered with a plaid plate. The kitchen made it especially clear that Anastasia lived here alone. A couple of small pots, a teacup forgotten on the table, a single stool beside a small table. Now her loneliness, like a baton. Anastasia has passed her loneliness to Maggie. The girl went to the window. That's what was fortunate about this house, the place where she stood, on the corner where the boulevard ended and the square began. A fountain with bronze figures of children, and behind it, a theater building, columns, arches, a real palace. I had to start living, everything from scratch. To go to the store and get at least bread, tea, and sugar, wash the dusty curtains, put things away. But Maggie hesitated, staring at the building that reminded her of a palace. She knew something was about to happen. The feeling was so clear that a chill ran down her spine. She needed to stop being a Robinson at heart, to end the involuntary reclusiveness she'd been living in all these years, to get to grips with all the things she still didn't know, to understand what stores she needed and how she should behave in them, what and where in this big city, how to use transportation. Maggie's situation was worse than that of a foreigner, the one who didn't know the language but understood some general principles, drew parallels. Maggie was perfect, a blank slate, and she didn't have a single familiar soul in this city, only scrappy, vague memories from her childhood of what and how things should be. For she had been very young then, she had just turned 6. Her first forays into the world had been closer to traveling to another planet than walking around town. She found a bakery on the first floor of her house, and that's where she went. Not knowing the value of money, she always bought very sparingly, but there were days when she made do with bread and milk. At moments when she was worried, her appetite was turned off completely, and now she was always shivering because of the abundance of new impressions that life had prepared for her. But almost every evening she found an opportunity to sit by the window. At 7 o'clock the play began in the theater, and on the eve of the performance, cars would arrive. Dressed-up people would rush to the entrance and climb the steps. Maggie had never been to church, but something similar, reverent, she felt, emanated from this palace. And the expression Temple of Art was unfamiliar to her. And yet, unable to resist what was urging her to go there, she bought the ticket. It was imperative that she should go in with the others. She had not much in the way of outfits. In fact, these modest things could not be called outfits, except for a black silk dress which she rarely wore, and which looked newer than the others. The last time Maggie had worn it had been to Anastasia's funeral. As she arranged her hair into a simple style, she hesitated for a few moments. There was only one mirror in her apartment, a small one in the bathroom. The only thing she could see in it was her face, and even then in the dim light, and she needed to know what she was like. And Maggie knew who would tell her the truth. She went to the mirror, whose silent presence she had always felt, and lifted the tulle she had draped over it. A thin, almost ethereal girl stared at her inquisitively. She looked like an illustration in a book. The big eyes and the hands, the outline of the head, the neck, exactly like a graphic. Maggie sighed, both convulsed and relieved. She realized why the mirror saw her that way. Subconsciously, she feared that grief, confusion, helplessness had disfigured her soul. She'd already realized by now that it was the soul that the glass reflected. But no, she had not yet found herself in the world, absorbing what she saw, forgetting herself. And the mirror made her look like that, like a stroke of a pen had drawn her now, and still she was good. A quarter of an hour before the performance began, she walked through the doors of the theater, immediately joining the stream of spectators. Never before had there been so many people around. They crowded in the check room, strolled through the foyer. In fact, there was nothing special about this theater that would make it stand out from the others. Stairs to the second floor, and from there, the entrance to the balcony. At the foot of the stairs was a small winter garden and a pond with goldfish. A buffet in the corner. There is music, laughter, and colored lights. Because Maggie had just looked in the mirror, she saw very vividly now, in fragments, as if she were moving from one picture to another. Here was a hand with a crystal glass, a straw rising from the white foam. Here was a fish wagging its tail in the mysterious depths, and the tail was translucent, like a golden plum. The doors of the hall opened. Everything was full of expectation, premonition. Maggie entered timidly, as if she was not sure whether she had the right. The place where the miracle would be performed, she felt it. But it was impossible to fully immerse herself in this impression. She had to find her row, her place. Finally, she sank down into the red velvet chair and froze, hardly breathing. The performance made an overwhelming impression on her. It must have been a long time since anyone cried at an old operetta. Silva had been in this theater for years. But Maggie was mesmerized by the music. Tears came to her eyes, and she was sitting near the stage. And when Silva threw the edge of her bow on her shoulder, a scarlet feather fell into the girl's lap. Maggie clutched it in her fingers in a purely mechanical gesture. Almost from the very beginning, her gaze was fixed on the actor who played the protagonist. Maybe he matched Edwin in years. He was older, but in acting, everything is conditional. Maggie saw a tall, statuesque man with noble features, and how he gave his hand to the heroine. It was tenderness. To the fingertips, the tenderness that makes the heart stop. Maggie had a bad realization that the play was over and she had to go home. She could still hear the music, still be there. And at home, she could think of nothing else but the magical fairy tale unfolding before her eyes. And never before had she had such dreams as she had that first night. From that day on, Maggie became a regular at the theater. There was a ballet and an opera, but she always went only to the operetta, where the poster bore the name of the artist whose image now appeared to her as soon as she closed her eyes. Week after week, month after month, Maggie lived like that. She tried to do things during the day, still bought herself some meager food, looked for a place that would hire her. But things didn't work out, and the people who refused Maggie were understandable. The girl gave the impression of being weird. It was as if she was looking at you, but she saw something of her own, and her lips smiled slightly. The unsure lady asked her bluntly and rudely, "Are you sick?" Maggie shuddered and looked as if she had woken. "No." "What did you say?" "That's the very thing. We have production here, workshop. Everyone has to be attentive, and you're dreaming in some clouds. No, you can't even go to the factory as an apprentice." Maggie realized that the money was running out. Meanwhile, the city was preparing for the new year, dressed in sparkling garlands, and the words "Happy New Year" could be heard more and more often. It was only a couple days before the holiday when the frost hit. What a frost. You couldn't run from store to store, your fingers were glazed, and it seemed like they were going to break off like icicles. And it was necessary that, taking her jacket in the check room after the performance, Maggie heard the two girls in front of her discussing whether it was worth waiting at the exit to ask for an autograph or whether it was too cold and better to go straight home. Eventually, they decided to wait, and Maggie realized she would join them. She didn't need an autograph, but to see the man she thought about day and night beside her, oh, that would be a precious gift. They came out of the theater, and the frost immediately burned their cheeks. Everything around them was as bright as it is when the thermometer drops below -30. The headlights of the cars, the lights of the advertisements, the lanterns, the Christmas tree in the square, the stars in the sky. The sharp rays of light crashed and poured in from everywhere. Maggie's eyes were watering, but she was afraid to blink, lest her eyelashes stick together from the frost. The girls wore fur coats and warm gloves, and she wore a jacket with fish fur and a knitted cap. And yet, bored and cold, they were ready to leave. and she mentally asked them to wait because alone, without them, would not dare to approach the artist. Her sacrifice was endless. She was ready to stand like that all night long. The second wave. The audience had long since dispersed, began to leave the theater, those who had taken part in the performance. Maggie was afraid of not recognizing them, of missing out. All her hope was in these girls. Maggie knew that they were waiting for the same person, and so the girls hurried towards someone, slipping. The granite slabs in front of the theater were icy. Taylor did not come out alone. He was accompanied by a short, stout man, wearing a gray coat and an Ushanka hat. Evans. Maggie heard the young voices. The girls surrounded the artist, slipping him programs, their heads close together. Taylor wrote something and complained that the ink in the pen froze in the cold. Maggie moved closer, forgetting everything as she listened to his voice. And then the girls, laughing and thankful, hurried to the bus stop. It was a stone's throw away, and the artist looked at Maggie. "Baby, what do you want?" An autograph, from excitement. And the fact that she was freezing, Maggie couldn't even utter a word. Taylor's companion was also looking at the girl. He was about 45 years old. Plain, unimpressive face. The artist had gotten serious. "Maybe, you got someplace to go?" Maggie could have pointed to her house across the square, not 2 steps, but 1.5 steps. But she was shivering like a puppy. She would have been shivering like that if it had been a hot summer. It was all about who was talking to her. The men looked at each other. "We'll go with us," said Evans, concerned and yet very gently. "At least you'll have a warm night's sleep. You'll be cold here by morning, child." Later, Maggie learned that there was nothing surprising in the artist's behavior. He came from a theatrical family. His father also played, and his name was known. And do not count how many families have survived the tour, semi-poor conditions, sometimes lived in poor hotels, and Mom Evans took care of young artists, as if, and really was their mother. She took care of dinner, took care of things. Long ago there was no mom in the world, but Taylor remained her favorite son. And in an instant, the seemingly forgotten was resurrected, and he acted the way she would have acted. It turned out that the companion was an old friend of his, a journalist, and both of them were glad to meet each other. It was warm in the car. Maggie settled into the back seat and listened to their conversation, not really getting into it and not really believing what was going on. Taylor lived in one of the old houses on the same boulevard that had become the local Arbit 30 years ago. In the 90s, the tenants of the apartments on the first floor had been forced to move out, some by kindness, some by threats, and now it was all small. And the boulevard was decorated before New Year's Eve as beautifully as any street in the city, and the lanterns created an illusion of the 19th century, and the imagination could easily conjure up horses, carriages, ladies in long dresses and furs. "Evans, do not start any variety. I have an ulcer," said the journalist. And our guest should be poured hot tea by all means." Maggie sat in the big room on the couch and put her hands between her knees, trying to keep warm at the same time, and to make sure no one saw her fingers shaking. Evans, what a hostess, took his time sacredly making tea and sit down, don't help me, cutting cheese and sausage. If the journalist didn't want to eat, the girl was undoubtedly hungry and needed to be fed. She looked so exhausted. He filled her plate himself, poured tea into a large mug. The men talked for a while. Maybe they wanted to give Maggie a chance to come to her senses, or maybe they'd gotten carried away and forgotten about her. Maggie caught bits and pieces of phrases. They talked about new plays, about some famous guitarists who were passing through their town. Evans wanted to hear them, but he didn't have to. "And I sat in their hotel room all night," said the journalist. "Vincent got carried away and played one thing after another." "No, tell me why you came to me," Evans said suddenly to Maggie, and she, who all these months had not told anyone anything about herself, really began to tell, rambling, confused, sometimes stopping for a long time, choosing words, then finding them, then not finding them. She didn't hide the fact that she'd grown up in the old house that was the stuff of legends. Blushing slightly, she said that Anastasia was a distant relative who had replaced everything for her. Her friends, her classmates. But now Anastasia was gone, and Maggie had no joy left but to live an illusion. Evening after evening to forget about everything while the performance is going on and you can drown in this music, live, breathe it. And Maggie does not need anything else. Well, and she has no work yet, although it was not worth mentioning it at all. It is only hers, Maggie's problems. When she stopped talking, Taylor looked at his friend. A movement of his eyebrows. "What's up, Thomas? You know what occurred to me." Even said my sister-in-law and I don't get along very well, but as they say, we observe politeness. We try to do each other favors. She has her own beauty salon, and there, as far as I know, there's a turnover. It's not about the salary. The lady's character is very bitchy. But for the first time, don't you want to try? I'll write her a note. It's impossible to reach her on the phone. There are conversations going on all day long. Try it, girl, and then we'll think of something else. And every time I hope that you will say that Ilan is yours, divorced, said the journalist. I always thought that Leanne, on the 10th husband, will not stop. She will go head over heels, climbing higher and higher. Leanne will be the end of the road for her. I don't know who'll be able to find a common language with this bitch. Still, Maggie waited a few days, didn't go anywhere, didn't inquire about a job, gathered her courage. The New Year's holidays helped her too. Everything was closed everywhere you looked. And then the money ran out completely and irrevocably. She couldn't ask for alms, could she? She found out the address of the beauty parlor and went. Maggie always walked now, even if the ends were large. She told herself that this way she would get to know the city, which was still unfamiliar to her. And there was nothing else to do but sit at home. On the way, she convinced herself to hold firm. The worst that could happen is that she would be rejected. But life didn't end there either. Then she would look for something else. Besides, she had a note from an old artist. Donovan seemed such a deity to her that she could not imagine who could refuse him. But she found it amusing that he was Taylor, and she was Taylor by her new surname. It was like a roll call in space. Or maybe Anastasia, sensing something, had chosen that name for her. Maggie encouraged herself. But when she saw the modern two-story building, she was afraid again. It looked like an expensive and very large cube, the kind of thing a giant might play with. She glanced once more at the address she had written down on the paper, hoping that it was a different house. No, it was a beauty parlor. Maggie sighed, clenched her hands into fists, and started up the steps. The door opened in front of her, sending a wave of warm air through it. Maggie walked in and froze, not knowing where to go next. Who to turn to. At the reception desk sat a girl, very young, pretty, in a uniform green robe. She said hello and asked if Maggie had an appointment, and if so, who did she have an appointment with? I'm about the job. Maggie had to cough and repeat the phrase. A second girl came up to the receptionist, white, tall, statuesque, her hair in a ponytail. Judging by her robe, she worked here too. She was obviously going to say something, but when she heard Maggie's words, she just snorted. And the receptionist was still trying to remain polite. What did you want to be? Do you have some kind of education? Maybe you're a beautician, a hairdresser, manicurist, anything. Maggie felt a pleading note in her voice. No, I didn't go to just high school. Me, she wants to be a cleaning lady, explained the redhead with a ponytail to her coworker. No, I don't think we have any. The receptionist began. Girl, said the redhead contemptuously, you should start somewhere else. Like waving a rag at the train station. Here you have to fit in, you know, like came to us and transformed. Clients shouldn't see people like that from the street, you know. Don't you look after yourselves at all? Maggie was so hurt, so confused, that she didn't even think of running away and slamming the door. But slamming the sliding door wouldn't have worked anyway. But then another woman entered the lobby, and Maggie immediately felt both women pull up. It was impossible to ignore her, and Maggie couldn't take her eyes off her for a few seconds either. The woman was young, short in stature, but with a regal posture. Her black dress emphasized the whiteness of her skin, and her hair, also black, fell in waves over her shoulders. Her lips, painted with bright red lipstick, were striking. The woman looked like an actress from an old movie. Or maybe she was just looking like Dita Von Teese. Eileen Bush, the redhead with the ponytail, began. Maggie realized that before her was the owner of the salon, the same Leia with a bitchy character. The girls obviously wanted the scene with Maggie did not attract the attention of the boss, but she was already looking at Maggie and raised her thin eyebrows, waiting for an explanation. Maggie didn't have to look for the note, all the while clutching it in her pocket. And this is probably for you. She held out a piece of paper. Eileen Bush unfolded the piece of paper, took one look at it. Her expression didn't change, and she seemed to make decisions quickly. Now you going to be a cleaner? She asked. You have no education, and we have no other vacancies. Maggie nodded hastily. You can go out tomorrow. At 8 o'clock, you'll come with your documents to Kate. She nodded at the receptionist. She'll show you what to do. Eileen Bush crossed the lobby with a swift step. There was business waiting for her somewhere out there in the parlor offices. The girls were silent. Maggie nodded awkwardly at them, but there was still silence in the hall when she went outside. It is wrong to think that the work of a cleaner is the easiest. Anyone can do it, and that it doesn't take much skill to wag a rag. In the first days, Maggie was afraid that she would be kicked out with a bang. There was so much to remember, so many little things not to miss. After all, she had seen all these jars with cleaning and disinfecting agents for the first time, and now every day she had to do like a general cleaning in offices, halls, toilets, and not a speck of dust, not a speck of dust. Perhaps she worked harder than she really needed to. She stayed when everyone had long since gone home, and before she left, she would go over the surfaces with a white handkerchief to see if it was clean. One time she was even pitted by an elderly security guard. "You live far away," he told her. "Where are you going to go across town now? You don't have money for a cab yet, I know. Lie down here on any sofa and sleep till morning." But Maggie looked at him with such frightened eyes that he just waved his hand and said, "Do as you please." And she was afraid of any arbitrariness, any violation of the rules, in case she was about to be pointed at the door. She saw her first job as the only one in the world. She had no idea where she would go if she was chased out of here. The salon soon stopped noticing her. She was so mute, wouldn't say a word. She never objects to anyone. She nods and does as she's told. "Girls, we have a cleaner, some kind of patient, Nora," W.I. said to her co-worker's red-haired Laura. "Well, the one from the fairy tale about Morozko. She's actually Maggie," the hairdresser objected. "Well then, Maggie's patient. Before her, it seems. No one here with a mop and a rag could hold out for long. The salary is 3 pennies, but our loca asks for a lot. Let's see how long this one lasts." However, Laura immediately forgot about the cleaning lady. In her opinion, she was not worth even a mop. Maggie kept her eyes on her. She especially liked to watch the makeup artist at work, though she only did it surreptitiously. Sometimes, as Maggie walked by, an unassuming middle-aged woman would sit in the chair. And then Maggie would meet her in the lobby when the client was getting dressed, and the girl couldn't help but notice how much better looking she was, as if she had partially regained her younger years. And there was a sparkle in her eyes, and one day Maggie couldn't take it anymore. When she was cleaning Camelia's makeup artist's office in the late afternoon, she sat down in the chair herself, touched her eyes with a brush, then her eyelids, touched her eyelashes with mascara and her lips with lipstick, and stared at her transformed face for a long time. The next day, no one noticed her imposture, and since then Maggie had occasionally allowed herself to steal. When there was no one else in the salon but her, she painted her new image. She had only glimpsed Camelina's work, but she tried to imitate it, and she couldn't believe herself. She was becoming completely different. Mature and very beautiful, she was now coming home so tired that the only strength left was to take a shower, drink tea, and sleep. The mirror hung like that, covered in a dull haze. Sometimes, if Maggie woke in the night, she thought she saw someone in white standing in the corner. She was startled for a moment, then remembered what was in front of her and closed her eyes again. Once, when she thought her makeup came out particularly well, she dared to lift the cloth and look at herself, and she shuddered violently. There, in the looking glass, she was exactly as she had been before, very young, without any makeup. Just a girl of 18, thin, with big frightened eyes. But the room behind her was not reflected, as if it were not there at all. It was just darkness. It frightened Maggie, and she hastily put the towel back and stepped back with a pounding heart. There was no reason, though, no reason at all. The salary, which the girls scornfully called 3 pennies, was enough for now. At work, Maggie immediately changed into her uniform and stayed in it all day. Work and home, she never went anywhere else, and she had nothing to spend her money on. She had not yet seen for herself the temptations of the big stores, and now there was no energy left for the theater. Surprisingly, after Evans had talked to her, she was no longer as eager to go to plays as she had been when she had breathed them. Maggie knew now that she had been given something more. She could call Taylor. He'd given her his phone number and talk to him, to himself, not stare silently out of the auditorium at his character, like not just her, but the entire audience. No, she hadn't dialed his number, but she had it, which meant that at any moment she could pick up her cell phone, and already that made her feel happy. She spoke to him mentally, and for now that was enough to say that evening. She didn't realize that Aileen Bush had stayed in her office. Maggie was about to finish her work when she heard someone enter the lobby. The guard said hello and was answered by a male voice. Surprisingly, the visitor, who had come in at an odd time when none of the masters were present, was not asked to leave. The visitor walked down the hall toward the office where Maggie was finishing mopping the floor. The girl hurriedly bent over. The partition separating her from the corridor was made of glass, and Maggie saw a young man in a light-colored coat with pleasant and somehow familiar features. "Good evening," he began, and where? They looked at each other. Maggie was a little confused, wondering if she would be guilty of something. The young man looked as if he were enchanted. Working this late. He didn't know what to say, and it was obvious he'd said the banal words just to avoid being impolite. "And you were looking for..." And immediately she realized who was in front of her. This is what Evans might have looked like when he was younger. "So it's Eileen Bush's husband," Maggie said, what she didn't doubt. "No, she's probably long gone. And if you see your father, please thank him for me." "But we agreed to meet here," said the young man, "and you are the girl my father told me about." So he hadn't forgotten about her yet. And Maggie's lips trembled. She was trying to hold back a smile. So they looked at each other and smiled. "Well, I guess if it was about a tramp freezing outside the theater, that's me." About me, heels tapped on the stairs. Eileen Bush was coming down. One glance at Maggie was enough for her to notice and appreciate her makeup, and to understand its origin. "You'll put $3,000 in the cash register tomorrow." She had been addressing the girl as you for a long time. "If you touch the cosmetics again, you'll be fired." Maggie turned away hastily to hide her flaming face. She knew she wouldn't reach for the jars and boxes on Camelia's table again. Wouldn't even look at them. She'd gotten herself in trouble after all. "Nolia." The young man began with a soft reproachfulness. Maggie remembered his name, Erlan. Elon Smith. But Eileen Bush did not wish to pay any more attention to this episode. She talked about her own business, about some accounts, and was the first to head for the door. Eileen Smith, with a guilty glance at Maggie, followed when the girl was alone. The guard in the lobby was not to be counted. It seemed to her that her strength had run out all at once. She didn't think she had enough to finish cleaning. She sat hunched over on a bench in the hallway for a while, and then she scrubbed the floors. And then she literally walked home. It was snowing, beautiful big flakes. There was no wind, and the snow was falling so slowly that it looked like a curtain connecting heaven and earth. I wanted to sit down and not go anywhere else. And for some reason I wanted to cry. No matter how tired Maggie was that night, she could hardly sleep. She shuffled back and forth on the narrow, hard bed, desperate to get up and not even doze off yet. She got up, dripping valerian, the only medicine she had, and then anger replaced the sadness that brought tears to her eyes. Or rather, a stray thought struck her, but it won't come true. It probably won't come true. Maggie ran to the bathroom, took a small mirror off the wall, breathed on it, and wiped it thoroughly. Then, holding it in her hands, she held it up to the larger mirror. After all, she herself, looking for a while into the magic glass, is charged with its power, then maybe, and the ordinary mirror will take over her, at least for a while. Maggie stood like that for a few minutes, and then looked in the small mirror. It worked. The same reflection was looking back at her as in the big mirror. Maggie knew that soon enough it would all be over, that the cheap glass would be left to itself, but she hoped what she had planned would succeed, and who would be able to expose her in that case? That evening, as she finished her work, Maggie didn't think about the makeup or Camellia. None of it interested her anymore. She left the landlady's office for last. She left, taking from Eileen Bush's desk a small mirror on a stand, an expensive Italian mirror that was always on the salon owner's desk. Maggie left the mirrors to talk to each other overnight, and in the morning, as she tucked her mistress's piece into her purse, she felt that it seemed heavier. Maggie arrived at the parlor before anyone else and managed to put the mirror back in its place unnoticed. She closed the office and hurried downstairs to her den, to the rags, the brushes, the vacuum cleaner. She recognized her boss's footsteps immediately. Only Eileen Bush wore such high heels to work. There were voices in the corridor, girls greeting the mistress. She answered them. There was Eileen coming up the stairs. For a while, silence. But Maggie was now as if she were all sharpened to hear. Her hearing was suddenly so sharp that she marveled at herself, and she heard it, that suppressed, horrified shriek. Maggie couldn't help herself, opening the door to the stairs. She knew she couldn't go into her boss's office. She knew she couldn't go into the supervisor's office unless she really shouted enough for everyone to hear, and then she could go in with the crowd. But it was impossible not to find out what had happened. Maggie had barely made it to the second floor when there were false footsteps. Maybe that's how zombies walk. Dumb pause. Dumb, 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 pawn, pause, dumb. The office door opened, and Eileen Bush appeared on the threshold. Her eyes were halting. She was groping her face and looked absolutely stunned. No way, no how. She had discovered a fatal disease. And she ran like a girl to the end of the hall. Maggie realized where she was going. There was another mirror hanging in the bathroom. She couldn't know what her superior saw, but she could clearly picture it. The fixed round eyes of a bird of prey, the leathery skull, the disheveled hair, a wicked grotesque of what she thought was the most beautiful thing in the world. And after all, Eileen Bush, when the first acute impression is past and she is convinced that she has not lost face, she will not even be able to arrange a reprimand to the girls. No one brought anything to her office. Just her favorite mirror, which stands in the same place, played a cruel joke. Maggie was cleaning as if nothing had happened when the female employees began to whisper that the boss felt unwell, called a cab, and went home. I couldn't even drive myself, can you believe it? God, maybe she'll take a sick leave at least once in 100 years. Will at least rest without that vulture, was heard from all sides. You can't wish for bad things, it'll come back to you. Let's wish her a trip around the world for about 3 years, to steady her nerves and ours. For girls loved Eileen Bush. I'll tell you that. In the evening, when Maggie was finishing cleaning, Erlan arrived unexpectedly. She flinched when he opened the door. What did he want here? His visit seemed to be nothing but trouble. Now she knew for sure that he hadn't come for his wife. Eileen Bush hadn't been here since this morning. Yes, in Ireland. As soon as he saw her, Maggie took his hat off his head and went to her with the sweetest smile. I wanted to apologize for yesterday, he said. I know that Leah can behave very unpleasantly to others, but maybe it's the laws of business to be tough. Otherwise, you can't reach the heights. I realize it's no consolation to you, but let me at least compensate you for what you had to spend because of my wife. You haven't done anything wrong. I understand, a young, beautiful girl. It's impossible to resist emphasizing her beauty. Len took some bills out of his wallet. Maggie recognized them. They were red $5,000 bills, and placed them on the dressing table. Maggie's eyebrows flew up. "Nee, this is for you. A little more for moral damages, as the lawyers say. Maybe you'd like to buy yourself some perfume or something, some trifle. I'd be very glad to know that you've forgiven this unpleasant episode and are not angry. I'm still not taking it. How's Evans?" The first phrase came out in a shorthand, the second eagerly. Every piece of news about Taylor, even in passing, was precious to Maggie. No, father. Rowan apparently didn't know how to switch so quickly. I've seen him for quite some time. We mostly talk on the phone. He seems to be doing well. Playing. Maggie sincerely could not understand how, having all the opportunities to be near such a man, and she did not see Taylor's equal now, one could not value it. Exchange it for something else. For talking with Island for some TV or club. Time was running out, and you could never make up for what you had wasted so ineffectively. At the same time, she felt that Erlan was talking to her in a special way, with unusual interest. The girls at the salon would have said hitting it off, but knew how indifferent she was to all this. It happens. Both are young, good-looking, and one of the parties makes every effort to sow some kind of spark, but in vain. There's no fire, not even a small one, not even the light of a candle. "Take it, please," Maggie said, gently placing the bills in Irish's hand and squeezing his fingers. "And don't torture yourself. I'm not angry. I really am." Taylor got married very early, while still a student in the vocal arts department. He was considered one of the best there, but he knew he was unlikely to see the Capitol stage, unless a miracle happened and he was invited. From other future singers, Evans differed unprecedented for actors' modesty. He realized that his voice was good but not unique, and he was categorically incapable of chewing his way out of a seat. Therefore, he had no doubt that if anyone would make it to the big stage, it would be less talented, but certainly more self-confident guys. All right, let it be a provincial theater, as long as he was given the ones he dreamed of. In his senior year, he was already involved in performances at the local opera and ballet theater. And there he saw her, Lara, a future ballerina who had the most beautiful legs in the world. He was coming up the stairs, and she was coming down to meet him, to go to her wing, which was the classrooms where the students of the choreographic school were engaged. He saw her singing feet, as he called them afterward, and could not take his eyes off them. He began to look for an opportunity to meet her, but she seemed to be avoiding him. She didn't answer the notes he passed with the other guys, the ones who were braver. And when he got her number and tried to call her, she wouldn't answer his calls. Her confrontations can please. No, I hate being looked at like a circus horse. I saw where you were looking and what you were looking at. But that's the first impression, he excused himself. I saw the face and the soul. Only a little later it was when they were both involved in the same play, and he put all the flowers he got. And he was playing the main character and the bouquets didn't fit in his hands. At her feet, when they married, his teacher jokingly rebuked him for putting a cross on his future. If you're married, you'll lose half the interest, if not most of it. Why don't you want to keep the audience intrigued for longer? Look at the characters you play. Can you remember a single play that starts with a happy wedding? That's the finale, and that's where you've chosen to start. But Taylor didn't care what anyone thought of it. He knew that he had met the only woman in his life, that he was a one-woman man, and that it was fate. But it turned out that Laura didn't think so at all. As it turned out later, Laura was attracted by the prospect, a young, handsome, talented artist from a famous family. Laura was still very young and thought that fame and a well-to-do life would come with the package. But then everything went wrong. Ireland was born, and immediately, he and his father were to blame for everything. Lara suffered at once. Figure, career, and ego. Her to return to the former form could not manage. In the theater, she was not expected at all. Unlike her husband, she was still only a corps de ballet, where no one would notice her absence. And to sit in the apartment, so simple, ordinary, to do the usual household chores, Lara shuddered. She was always acutely aware of how short a woman's life was. And a missed day was like a missed year to her. A year of tantrums, hand-wringing one nanny, another, and the old freedom doesn't come back and no roles are given. And how sickening it is to stand over pots and take up the mop. Eventually, Laura ran away. Island was not yet 5 years old when she left her son with the nanny, a note to her husband, and disappeared so suddenly that if it hadn't been for the note, a manhunt would have been launched. Laura found herself much later. In the capital, somewhere there, she settled in theater circles, quite possibly not as a dancer, but as some kind of administrator. The main thing, in the art and in the right circles, that she is going to remarry. Evans learned when his wife asked for a divorce. But who became her next companion and what ended her struggle with everyday life? This was not even rumored. Taylor, on the other hand, continued to consider himself a one-woman man. He saw nothing good in it. Rather, he thought of it bitterly as ugly. Take, for example, those dogs who pine for years and wait for their master's return. If the whole canine species were like that, it would be extinct. We need to shake things up and get back on track, but Taylor couldn't. He found a nice older woman who cared for Igor like a grandmother, and she settled into his home for many years, gradually becoming a member of the family from a nanny, a theater, and a son. That's all Taylor's life was made of after Laura left. But the longer time went on, the more friends he made. His sincerity and charm, the complete absence of star disease, care for others, and the aura of great talent, which could not help but feel. All this made it so that people were drawn to him, and a certain circle was formed. Undoubtedly, Evans hoped that his son would be his main friend when Ireland grew up, but the young man almost repeated his own fate. He married very early and a frank bitch, except that neither theater nor talent Ireland had, and God knows what kept his soul. Taylor could not find out. Leah was doing her best to limit communication between father and son, fearing bad influence, that Erlan would ask for freedom, but there were others. The same Thomas Adams, who also lost a son, only hopelessly the boy died. Thomas also reached out to Taylor for comfort. People of different professions and different characters in the house of the artist found that place where material things remained behind the threshold, and only what was valued in childhood and youth. Kindness, nobility, dreams, matters. Amsran said that Taylor has his own mafia. Remember the Godfather, Evans? Don Corleone solved all his cases through friends, acquaintances, relatives. Only most people owed him something and paid the debt. You too. No matter what you have, whether you get sick, whether you need help, you'll find everything you need from your friends. But your mafia is not based on fear and duty, but on love. Maggie was one of the first to notice him when he came in again, but she hoped sincerely that he was not here to see her. She was in her office, and the salon was full of customers, but she was not going to be complimented by Alan Smith in this atmosphere, or to be handed that unfortunate money again. Nevertheless, it was to her that Ireland headed. "Please," Maggie said, "I told you. You don't have to give me anything back. It's really my fault. So it's a normal fine. I'm not here for that at all. Elon looked very tired and gaunt. Father is ill. Can't you be his nurse for a few weeks? He asked. If you can. Of course, Maggie's voice was clear. She was ready to go right now without even putting on her jacket. I don't care if she loses her job. What about him? An intermittent sigh. There was no play in Irish's gaze now, only anxiety. And Maggie was looking at him just as anxiously. Doctors are diagnosing pneumonia. For now. You know what could happen with that diagnosis. Anyway, there's no way to know yet. There's a doctor there every day. A nurse comes in to give shots. But you need someone to be with you at all times. Are you on the machine? Maggie asked. God, what a fee. What are you talking about? Don't hurt me. The next 2 weeks were probably the hardest in her life. The disease was ready to win, to take the artist with it, as it had already taken many and many. The doctor was from the same mafia. From close friends, came twice a day. The nurse came even more often. Her name was Isabella, and as Maggie realized, she had been in love with Taylor before. Isabella knew her work perfectly. She had a light hand for injections, but as often she had tears in her eyes, which is not typical of nurses. Maggie, Siri, in addition to night duty for the sick man, took care of the household. One day, when Evans had fallen asleep, she and Isabella, both drunk with fatigue, were drinking tea in the kitchen. You know, he's so simple, so kind, so available, Isabella said. And Maggie knew she was talking about Taylor, but he doesn't really want to love anyone else. And he's built this ice wall between himself and the people around him that's thin, transparent, you can't see it. But it's there. I tried, figuratively speaking, to press my whole body against it and melt it, but I couldn't. I just froze myself over and over again. And it hurt so much to thaw. Maggie was given strict orders from the doctor to take her temperature and saturation every hour, and if anything, to contact him at any time of the day or night. And then call an ambulance. Evans didn't complain. Only said once with a guilty smile, I keep looking for a pose that will make it easier to breathe. My lungs feel like they're flooded with water. And then he had, children, don't worry. I've lived long enough. Don't worry about me. That day it seemed to her that an even more difficult time was coming and that the end might be near. So Maggie decided to go home and get some things so that she could stay here permanently. A few changes of underwear, the little things you can't do without if you're not in your own house. Maggie had everything she was going to take with her in a quarter of an hour. And then, she didn't know why. The movement was purely mechanical, automatic. She plugged the plug of the old radio into the socket. Every time she thought it would never come to life again, never make a noise. But it always woke up. There was a whistling sound, and then rustles, noises. Maggie spun the wheel slowly. Take the mirror to him, Anastasia said suddenly, as if she were in the next room. Maggie flinched so that the receiver almost fell out of her hands. Am I going crazy? She asked either herself or the radio, and almost immediately asked the question she thought she would never ask. Anastasia, what about my mom? Maggie hadn't thought of her mother in recent years, but now, as the emptiness approached, and no one would be by her side. She's not here, Anastasia said. Forgive me both, you and her. The noise came again, and it was so easy to imagine that it was all Maggie's imagination that she was beginning to have some sort of auditory hallucination from fatigue. And then she walked over and, biting her lip, began to remove the mirror from the wall. The Taylor's apartment was crowded until the evening, and this despite the fact that the doctor had forbidden all but the most important people to come, but there were quite a few of them. Besides his son, whose place was in any case here, there was Isabella, and also that partner who had sung with Evans for many years, and Thomas, who could not be excluded. But few people went into the room of the sick man himself. They crowded into the other rooms and into the kitchen, making tea and coffee, talking quietly. Everyone is surely waiting to say goodbye. Maggie's heart broke. But the sick man was dozing all the time. He didn't call out to anyone. Finally, near midnight, Maggie was the only one left in the house besides Evans. Usually this time was the most precious to the girl, but it was also the most difficult. She alone was responsible for anything that happened to Taylor during these hours. The sick man was half sitting up, covered with pillows, breathing hard, but each time he asked Maggie not to sit beside him, but to go to bed. Put my tea on the table and go. He pleaded. I promise. If anything, I'll call. He's not strong enough to call, Maggie used to think, but he's delicate enough. He'll try to go to the afterlife quietly, so as not to disturb anyone. And she distracted Taylor as much as she could, asked him about plays, about roles, about familiar artists. But often, when he enthusiastically began to tell, she noticed that he was choking, and then began to talk about anything herself, as long as he didn't chase her away. But presently, she brought him tea, and immediately went out and returned, carrying back the heavy thing. "No, what is it?" Evans asked quietly. The disease wouldn't let him speak any louder. "Mirror, look at yourself. You want to show me how sick and ugly I've gotten." Taylor stroked her arm with dry, hot fingers. "Maggie, I already know. Don't, really. You were welcome." Never had such a pleading tone been in her voice. And he looked. There was silence. Maggie looked not at the mirror, but at Evans. At first, his face became more and more stern even. It was the way one might look at an approaching storm, at an enemy on the offensive, and at the last line beyond which was eternity. Then his expression changed now. Evans looked as if he was eagerly waiting for the judge to pronounce a verdict or acquittal. And finally, tears came to his eyes. Then Maggie stepped back and looked too. He was very young there. That Taylor remained a child at heart, she knew. But now it was confirmed. Maybe only a little older than she was, about 25 years old, but no more. Not a king, but a prince. And yet, it was undeniably him, impossible not to recognize. And his gaze was both trusting and wise and something else. It was as if he knew everything, as if he'd been where Anastasia was now. Evans sighed convulsively, but as deeply as if the air had finally broken through his chest. "I'm out of breath," he said, not believing himself, "but I can't be like this. If I am like this, then all of life is justified. It means that in what I've experienced, I've kept my soul." Maggie cried, covering her face with her hands. She felt as if she were the one who had been pardoned. "No, Thomas," Evans said. "I'm done with the stage. After what I've been through, I'm tired and out of breath. But that's not the point. I still want to live, all my life in art, in the realm of shadows, in imaginary images. And life slipped through my fingers. Now, as long as I am destined there, I want to go out on the grass in the morning to walk barefoot on it. I want to plant a garden, damn it. I want to go to the sea, not during the time free from touring, but when I want to see it." "That's quite a gift you've given yourself," Adam said. They walked slowly, turning from one garden path to another. Evans had sold his luxurious bar apartment, withdrawn his savings from the bank, and bought the old house. "It's not a gift for me," Taylor said seriously, "or rather, it's not just for me. It's primarily for her." Maggie was in the house, fiddling with dinner. "And of course, nothing will change for you," Evans went on. "All my friends can come to see me whenever they like, as long as they like. We'll have a table here in the garden, under the awning. Oh, what evenings we'll have. I think the house has learned a lot, too, in the time it's been in other people's hands. It won't be so unsociable now." "You look a lot younger than you used to," Adams looked at his friend, and an involuntary smile touched his lips. "We were scared for you back then. But it turns out your illness has done you good." Taylor patted him on the shoulder. They were silent for a moment. "Now I'm waiting." Evans couldn't procrastinate any longer. "Did you find her?" "Yes," the journalist took a piece of paper out of his pocket and handed it to him. "Maggie's mother's alive. She moved to a neighboring town, probably didn't want to see a place where everything reminded her of. She never married again, no children, working home, lives pretty much reclusive. Here's her address and phone number, of course. I didn't tell her myself. That's between you and Maggie." "I should probably be the first one to call," Evans said worriedly. "It would be too much of a shock if she heard her daughter's voice right away. And Maggie should be careful because she doesn't know yet either. Of course you don't die of joy, but if she could die, it was when we were all afraid for you. Do you remember what she was like then? She was black all over. Now I regret turning down the hospital, and she saw the whole thing. I should have gone in there behind closed doors. But then she wouldn't have saved you," Adam said simply. "So this whole chain, the whole thing, since that terrible flood, not one link in it was random, as nothing is random or meaningless." Maggie's voice came from inside the house. Now that she could breathe easier, she made coffee and hummed something simple, because she knew the old house wanted to hear living voices. Ashley was always called Sunshine. From the moment she was born, the little girl seemed to light up everything around her. When she was brought from the hospital, put on the table and unwrapped diapers, the many neighbors who had gathered for the event in their house, amicably aghast. Unexpectedly, they laughed. the baby, lying in front of them and amusingly moving freed arms and legs, as if glowing. The baby's light skin was covered with light, barely visible freckles, making her less white. "Oh, what if it's a disease?" Olivia, the girl's mother, exclaimed hysterically. "It's a rash, probably. How could they let you out of the hospital with such a disease?" "Olivia, stop screaming, you'll scare the child." The woman was shouted down firmly by the stately Emily, a mother of 5. Because of this, she was considered infallible in matters of health and education. "It's not a rash." She scrutinized the baby. "They're freckles. Your little redhead's like a dandelion." Emily was restrained in her emotions, but she smiled involuntarily, and the others smiled after her. The little girl, 5 days old, felt everyone's delight. Her eyes rounded, and her funny, wrinkled nose, as only babies can do, sneezed. On the top of her head, a strand of bright red hair tangled amusingly. On her temples and the back of her head, golden locks curled into amusing curls. Golden eyebrows and eyelashes completed the picture. "Well, just a sunshine," someone whispered admiringly. "A sunny little girl." But only she got a bad mother came a low voice from behind. A short, thin woman of about 50 strode resolutely through the crowd. Her thin hands, calloused from hard labor, deftly grabbed the little girl. "You're all whispering and grumbling," she said. "Come on, get out of here. There's nothing to frighten the child or jinx it." "Come on," Barbara Emily said conciliatingly. The others admired the baby in silence, only sighing occasionally. "It's worth it to see such a miracle. We seldom have anything that isn't dark as coal. And here is such a sunshine," laughed the other one quietly. "That's just it," Barbara said angrily, shooing her neighbors away from the table. "Go home, all of you, or I'll take a broom, and I'll spare your gray heads." Knowing her decisive temper and the fact that she was not used to throwing words around, the women started to leave. Barbara locked the door and turned to the mother of the little girl, who had been sitting in silence all this time. "Well, daughter, tell me, how are we going to live from now on?" She shrugged her shoulders. "As we lived before, so we will continue to live." "No," the mother replied resolutely. "You have a child now. You will not live as before." "You don't tell me how to live," replied the daughter angrily. "Can you do it without me?" Barbara hesitated. "There's your showdown lying there, waving its arms and legs." She waved her hand in the direction of the little girl, who was concentrating on her fingers. At the sight of the girl, her mother's angry, tense face instantly relaxed and blossomed. The deep wrinkles turned into rays that scattered to the sides. She approached the little girl and gently touched her tiny hands. The girl immediately grasped her grandmother's finger tightly. Barbara laughed softly and leaned toward her granddaughter, scrutinizing her. Her eyes lit up with tenderness. "And she is a sunshine," she said with a soft smile. "Our golden daughter." "A redhead like her father," she said sharply. "You can't find a golden one." These words brought Barbara back to reality. Barbara looked sharply at her daughter. Her face was hard and stern again, and her gaze was testing and distrustful. "I'm not going to discuss your affairs. It's none of my business. But you brought your child into my home, and it's my granddaughter," she emphasized the last 2 words. "Olivia, your daughter is your life now. And how are you going to live it? It's our business. It's mine too. So don't you dare talk to me like that. This is my home for now, and I own it." "I knew it," Olivia said, gloatingly. "I know that you'd reproach me for being your keeper." Barbara looked at Olivia regretfully and waved her hand tiredly. "Come to the child, mother," she said. "Why should I go near her?" Her daughter shrugged her shoulder. "She's not crying. So everything is normal." And so it turned out that all the care of the baby fell on the shoulders and hands of 55-year-old Barbara. Barbara was a very famous and notable person in the big, noisy village. The girl is short and thin. Nevertheless, she never got lost in the crowd of her peers. Her large brown eyes, thick blonde braid, and cheerful, never dull character made up for her lack of height and stature. She was beautiful with a special, calm, sweet beauty, and modestly dressed, always busy with an inordinate number of younger brothers and sisters, always freckled in bunches. Barbara never had a shortage of suitors. After graduating from teacher training institutes, Barbara returned to her native village and began working as a math teacher in the only school. A few years later, Barbara, who by then had blossomed into a lush, truly feminine beauty, to everyone's amazement and indignation, married a stranger. A stranger, as they called him in the village. Alex came from the city to work as a technician at a large livestock complex, and according to the village critics, other than a diploma in his profession, there was nothing outstanding about him. Barbara and Alex loved each other very much. It was obvious to the naked eye, and their love was something unusual for these places, not country. Alex gave his wife bouquets of flowers, carried her bags from stores, and carried her through puddles on his hands, which made men indignant, and women in a timid awe. Barbara wasted her hands washing his shirts by hand and rushing home from school in time to prepare a delicious dinner. Crazy people. What can you take from them? Waved at them and left the young family in peace. A year later, they had a daughter who was named Olivia. And when the girl was 7 years old, Alex was not. He died horribly and ridiculously. On a winter's evening, he was working late. His car froze. Waiting for a hitchhiker was hopeless, and Alex, without warning anyone, decided to walk home. 3 kilometers, separating the complex from the village, did not seem to him a great distance, but in an hour he would see his beloved wife and daughter. The night was not only frosty but also overcast, and Alex, a city man, quickly lost his way and went in a completely different direction. In general, Alex froze in the field, and the thick snow covered all his tracks. They searched for him for several days, when no one but Barbara had any hope. She believed to the last, believed in a miracle. But it wasn't until spring, when Alex's body was found, that she calmed down. After burying Alex, Barbara became a different person. It seemed that together with her husband, she put in the coffin of her joy, cheer, and laughter. She became withdrawn and taciturn, shutting herself away. The only place where one could see the old Barbara was at school. With children, she remained kind, patient, and fair. About new relationships after Alex's death, Barbara did not even think about. Local men tried to get close to her, to befriend her, to court her, and even, according to village tradition, to openly woo her. Barbara for many years remained a beautiful young woman with a straight back, a swift gait. But to all attempts to marry her, she answered with a firm refusal. She kicked matchmakers out of the house and sent suitors away. So she lived alone with her daughter Olivia, without asking for help, without complaining about fate. No one saw her tears. Gradually, everyone got used to the fact that she was a lonely, independent, and adamant woman, the eternal widow of her Alex. Olivia was growing up, different from the cheerful and smiling Barbara they remembered her as. It was probably Barbara's fault in many ways that Olivia grew up withdrawn and too serious for a girl. Her seriousness was sullen and directed at people rather than her studies. Almost never did Olivia smile, and no one could hear her laugh. At school, she had a reputation as a savage and a damsel with oddities. Her mother, even though they had no one else, was indifferent to her, showing little affection. There was no intimacy between them, the usual intimacy between a mother and her only daughter. Olivia had always kept a distance between herself and Barbara, and no one, including Barbara herself, was surprised that when she'd barely graduated from high school, Olivia had gone to the city without any special plans. All those years while Olivia was growing up, Barbara had been tormented with guilt toward her daughter. She realized that she didn't like Olivia, didn't give her warmth and tenderness, that all that care about Olivia, delicious food and beautiful clothes. Checking her lessons, it was all very important, of course, but it wasn't the main thing in the relationship between a daughter and her mother. What was the issue here? Was it that her feelings had died with Alex and she'd never been able to rekindle them for her daughter's sake? Or was it that Olivia was growing up too independent and didn't seem to need her mother at all? It probably didn't matter anymore. Olivia, I have a favor to ask of you. Barbara finally made up her mind and began a very difficult conversation with her daughter before she left home. I'm sorry to you, she said, and stopped talking when she looked up and saw the ironic look in Olivia's eyes. What is it, Mom? She said with a chuckle. Let's not do that. Thank God you haven't bullied me all these years or burdened me with errands. And now let's do without playing mother-daughter. Well, what did you want to say? She continued to look at the confused mother with a grin. Behave, study. Try not to get knocked up by the first guy you meet. I don't think I missed anything. Oh yes, and most importantly, my dear daughter. I love you very much and I'm always here for you, no matter what happens. So Barbara, having listened to her daughter's tirade, closed her eyes and took a breath. "Well, I guess I deserve it," she said quietly and humbly. "I love you very much, and I am always ready to help you in any way I can." She added, almost in a whisper, "No matter what happens." Olivia went to the city and rarely heard from him. She enrolled in a trade school, and after graduation she found a job with a trading firm. She did not stay long in the city, however, and returned home. Barbara was immensely happy about the return of her daughter, her hedgehog, as she called Olivia to herself. But the hedgehog had become even more prickly in the 4 years she had been away from her mother. "But Mom, what's there to tell?" She finally answered her mother's questions. "My city life didn't work out. Not everyone has to walk on asphalt in heels. Some people need to knead manure with their elbows." Olivia, of course, strongly exaggerated, so disparagingly talking about her small homeland, a village on the outskirts of which a huge cattle breeding complex was constantly growing and expanding. Due to this, in terms of living standards, livability, and size, it had long been not inferior to a small town. For some reason, Olivia was even a little offended by Barbara, who sincerely loved the place where she had lived almost all her life. "It's nice here," Barbara said. "We don't even have that manure lying around the barns. And there is a lot of work, including in your specialty. And we recently got gas, and they built a movie theater. Yes, yes. And birch trees, a river, and so on. We have everything." Olivia ended the conversation decisively. They were back to being mother and daughter. Barbara continued to work at her school, graduating new generations of students. Olivia, an accountant by training, went to work at the cattle farm. But work, like everything else in her life, did not interest her. She remained unsociable. In their house for a long time settled silence and despondency. And then, a few years later, Olivia suddenly changed. She began to stare at her reflection in the mirror for long periods of time, something she had never done before. And she didn't like what she saw. Mom, Olivia suddenly came out of her room one evening and spoke to her mother. "Maybe I should get a haircut. What do you think?" Barbara dropped the TV remote in surprise. Not only was it unexpected that Olivia would ask her to do something like that, but it was also a question of appearance. Olivia had little interest in how she looked. Barbara looked at her daughter, whose hair, long unwashed and overgrown, was twisted at the back of her head in a sloppy bun. "And a daughter," Barbara said with her hands. "Of course, that would be wonderful." She struggled to keep from asking why her daughter was paying attention to her appearance. The reason, however, soon became clear. "Andrew's mom works at the mill," Olivia said. "And, we've decided to get married. He doesn't have a place to live with me, of course." She was silent, waiting for her mother's reaction. Barbara sat down on the edge of her chair and tried to cope with the shock of her daughter's categorical statements. "But why didn't you say so in the first place?" she asked. "If that's what you've decided, it's just that it's all so sudden." "Why unexpected?" Smirked ironically at her daughter. "Don't forget, I'm almost 30 years old. How is that unexpected? I mean, I've never even met your man." "I don't even know his name," Barbara said, a little pathetically. "What's there to see? He's just a man, an ordinary man. And his name was Andrew." "Wait," Olivia. Barbara raised her hand and pressed it to her cheek, looking at her daughter fearfully. "Are you pregnant by any chance?" "Well, yes, I am," Olivia hummed. After spending the night without sleep, Barbara got up, determined. "Well, Olivia, if that's the way it's going to be, bring your chosen one. Well, will you bear me a grandson or granddaughter? And we'll live again as a big, friendly, normal family," she said, emphasizing the word normal. However, a normal, and even more so a friendly family did not happen again. It wasn't in Andrew's plans to start a family or to have a child. He was not a local and came to the mill for seasonal work, for which there was a shortage of laborers. The soft-spoken, uncommunicative, aloof Andrew and Olivia, who was a stranger to the place, was the bookkeeper. She was perfect for a casual, easy relationship. Especially since, for all her unsociability and unsociability, Olivia was not spoiled by male attention. Quite handsome, tall, broad-shouldered, with curly hair and a charming smile, Andrew was certainly attractive. A few simple compliments and signs of attention were enough for Olivia to give in to his advances. After realizing she was pregnant, Olivia decided that here was her chance to finally be a normal woman. In her position, All mothers are. For some reason, she was hesitant to tell Andrew about her situation. Meanwhile, Andrew's contract with the mill was coming to an end, and it was time for him to leave. When Olivia told him she was pregnant, 4 months pregnant, Andrew became angry. "What are you, an idiot?" he exploded. "What family? What baby? Don't you know what you should have done if you turned out to be so stupid? Look at yourself in the mirror, bride," he shouted angrily. "I've got 2 like you at every station." "No," he corrected himself. "There are no more like you. The rest of them are prettier somehow. But did you imagine I'd stay here with you and those cockroaches? No, you're really crazy." And so Olivia's slim hope for happiness was shattered. "Olivia, where is your boyfriend?" Barbara asked timidly a few weeks after her memorable conversation with her daughter. Olivia was back to her way of life. She sat unkempt, wearing an old tracksuit and biting her fingernail. The only thing new about her appearance was her belly, which was already quite noticeable. Olivia always wore loose uniforms, though, and no one but her mother knew about her situation. "Fiancé?" She grinned back. "The hell he knows, he's gone to look for another bride." "What do you mean?" Barbara sat down. It seemed to her that she was ready for everything, and her daughter couldn't surprise her. But as it turned out, she was wrong. The new news had hit her like a snowball. "Olivia, how could it be?" Yes, just like that, Olivia jumped up from the chair she'd just been sitting in, leaning against the wall. "Don't start lecturing me, okay? I'm sick of it." "What are you gonna do?" What? Get rid of it? I don't know how. They say it's a long time coming." "What are you talking about?" Barbara, too, got up impulsively and paced the room excitedly. "How can you get rid of your child, my daughter? It's a sin." She made a firm gesture to stop Olivia, who was obviously going to object, and her daughter, surprised by her mother's excitement, remained silent for some reason. "Have the baby," Barbara said heartily, but firmly. And as if stamping her decision, she even banged her fist on the table. We'll raise her. If you don't want to have a baby for yourself, at least have one for me, girl," she added quietly. Olivia shrugged and left the room. 5 months later, a girl was born with bright red hair and wonderful doll-like eyes. The eyes were an amazing gray-blue color. And this color was determined in the baby literally from the first days, and did not change anymore. "What shall we call her?" Barbara asked her daughter. Olivia shrugged. "Ashley." Barbara chanted one of her favorite names. "Ashley it is." Olivia agreed indifferently. The women in the village were treated differently by their strange, atypical family of 3 generations. Some shrugged indifferently, others with obvious incomprehension, but most were sympathetic. Everyone knew Barbara from childhood, remembered how tragically her family life successfully started, how absurd her relationship with her only daughter turned out to be. Missed Olivia because of her grief. The townspeople sighed and smiled involuntarily. But Ashley, it seems, was given to Barbara as a reward. The townspeople added in conversation among themselves. Barbara blossomed again. With the birth of her granddaughter, she, as if she had been mothballed for years, opened up again, studied, learned to smile. Olivia, seeing how her mother had completely dissolved into Ashley, was visibly relieved that she had completely shifted the care of the girl to her, and as if she had forgotten about her daughter. And so it turned out that at the age of 2, Ashley's real mom became her grandmother. "Don't you dare reproach me." Olivia cut her mother off when she tried to talk about Ashley needing a mom. "You weren't the perfect mom yourself, and that's okay. I grew up, and Ashley will grow up just as well as anyone else." Ashley didn't just grow up to be perfect. The girl was some kind of amazing creature. Clear eyes with a round face and a face thickly studded with golden short fuzz. She seemed to be smiling all the time. Even if the girl's lips were compressed, their corners were still raised, and the feeling of a quiet and sly smile did not leave the one who looked at her face. But if the little girl laughed with her shining white teeth, it was impossible not to smile back. The girl grew really pretty, a little snub nose, gray-blue eyes, plump lips, very light, as most redheads' skin. All this promised that the girl would grow up, if not beautiful, then certainly very pretty. But the main adornment of the girl was her hair, not flashy but bright. The red color of her hair was as if slightly accentuated by a light, strong shade. At the same time, the hair glistened and shimmered, as if there were elusive lights running through it. Like many children, her hair was tangled, and when it was time to cut her hair, Barbara looked at her granddaughter and sighed as she put the scissors aside, unable to do the deed. "Well, I cannot," she confessed to her neighbor. "Can you imagine? I can't lift my hand, I can't even cry. It's funny and sinful. You won't believe it. I sit and cry. And I realize that this hair is getting in the way, tangled in it. And I still can't pull myself together." In accordance with the hair, Ashley's character was also, as they say, golden. The girl was very active and mobile, liked to invent mischievous adventures, but at the same time was obedient and manageable. In her, there was not a hint of closeness and sullenness, which from childhood distinguished her mother. Ashley was a mocking and cheerful girl, ringing with silvery laughter every chance she got. What a sparkler, said the kindergarten teacher, where Barbara gave Ashley to when she was 2.5 years old. She herself continued to work at the school. Ashley grew from an adorable baby to an equally adorable girl. Her good fortune had passed all the skin problems and torment that spoiled the lives of so many teenagers. Her loosely curly hair remained her jewelry. At 13 to 14 years on Ashley, as she, not particularly wise, called in school, slowly looked at most of the boys' peers. True, in adolescence, sympathy is sometimes expressed in a very strange way. On a fall afternoon, Ashley, a sixth grader on the second shift, was carefully carrying a model of a building in her outstretched arms. It was the fruit of days of painstaking work in the evenings. Ashley had assembled it out of paper, matches, paper clips, and more, always thinking of new things to add. "Well, Ashley," she spun around. Barbara laughed. "What's that you've got there?" "This, Grandma, is the house of the future," proudly declared the girl. "And, well, if the future, then of course," said the grandmother respectfully, looking at the tiered construction of the parts, which were fastened in some intricate way. Finally, the intricate layout was ready, and so Ashley, carefully wrapping her precious pyramid around her arms, carefully but quickly stepped towards the school. "Hey, redhead," she heard behind her. "Ashley, why can't you hear me? I'm asking you." The girl stopped and, carefully afraid of dropping her precious cargo, looked back. She did. Standing behind her, smirking, was Justin, a boy from her class. A pretty obnoxious kid. Loved bullying, unless it was guaranteed to be seen by an adult. Justin and Ashley had run into this boy on various occasions, mostly trying to stop another boy's antics. Behind him, the faces of two more of Justin's boyfriends could be seen. Ashley sighed. Justin was a coward, and in another situation Ashley would have no trouble dealing with him, as she had done so many times. But right now she couldn't risk it. She needed to get her layout to school, which she was pretty sure she would win the school competition with. After all, she began in a very calm voice and a friendly smile. "Stay out of this. Please, I don't have time." No time for her. "Look, what's that you've got there?" "Guys, let's go see what she's dragging around." Ashley, in a last-ditch effort to protect her man-made marvel, turned her back to them and put her elbows out. But it didn't help her, of course. Justin shoved Ashley hard in the back, and one of the accomplices slapped his arms. The layout swayed, and as if sadly nodded one last time to its creator, and collapsed into the fall mud. Tears of indignation instantly filled Ashley's eyes and spurted from them. But she didn't smear them on her face. Ashley lunged at her abusers and grabbed the sleeve of her main abuser, Justin. Of course he would be in trouble, but there were 3 boys. There was no telling how the story would have ended for Ashley if there hadn't been a loud shout over their heads. "Come on, kids." They froze. At that, 2 of the boys were grabbed by the collars like kittens by the scruff of their necks. Justin, who was held only by Ashley, looked up and, instantly recognizing the situation, yanked his sleeve from Ashley's fingers and sprinted down the alley as fast as he could. His buddies, suddenly feeling free, followed. "If I see you again, I'll have you on crutches," came their way. Ashley stared at her masterpiece of future architecture. It had fallen apart from the impact with the ground, and the fall mud had already soaked the paper parts and turned them into mush. The girl squatted down and, sighing bitterly, began to collect the remains of the model. Tears rolled out of her eyes and hung ridiculously on her nose. Out of frustration, or rather grief, which was the biggest one so far in her short life. She didn't even immediately remember her unexpected savior. She looked up and met his eyes with a look quite grown up. Standing in front of her was a boy with shaggy blonde hair and a very serious face for a 15-year-old boy. Of course, Ashley knew this boy, as the whole school knew him. His name was Christopher. He was in ninth grade and was the school celebrity. Almost straight A student, captain of the school basketball team. He was the best at computers, already knew how to drive a car, owned a huge German Shepherd, and generally had such an unimaginable set of cool qualities that he seemed like a Superman against the background of his peers, and even those who were older than him. Among other things, Christopher was very handsome, and sports made his figure strong and broad-shouldered, and taught beyond his years. And here was this almost superhuman man now standing over Ashley and looking at her distress. At last he came up and bent to the ground with evident interest. "What have you got there?" he asked. "It's a model of a building of the future." "Well, you know, we have a contest for sixth graders. Well, I wanted to participate so badly. I spent almost a month making it." She was surprised by the guy's interest in the model. "By yourself?" he questioned with disbelief. "By myself, really?" Ashley widened her eyes even more, making them look huge. "Well, my grandmother helped me. 2 roses, but not much. Don't worry, I did most of it myself." "That's great," Christopher said, suddenly delighted. Ashley suddenly remembered her misfortune and tears came to her eyes again. She angrily wiped her face and finally remembered what was important. "Oh, I didn't thank you for driving them away. Help me out. Except it's too late." "Nothing's too late," he declared. "Look at that, 3 pieces almost unharmed." Christopher spoke, carefully shifting the parts onto dry leaves. "This one here, I don't know what you've got. You'll have to completely redo them, of course, but you remember how you glued them together. And these 2 things here, but it's just a matter of replacing a few things. No problem at all." And Christopher suddenly smiled at the girl. "Thanks," Ashley said, confused. "Except I probably won't make it in time anyway. The competition is the day after tomorrow." "You'll make it if you want to," said the savior emphatically. "Your name is Ashley. I believe you're Barbara's granddaughter, right?" Ashley nodded, looking at Christopher mesmerized. "Look, let's put it this way." He thought for a while. "I don't have practice tonight. I'll come over tonight, if that's okay, and help you out a little. Just help me glue and cut. That doesn't count. The idea is yours." "Can you do that?" Really, Ashley, unable to believe her ears, continued to stare at Christopher with all eyes. "What a pair of eyes you have," the boy suddenly uttered. "All right, Carrot Top. See you later." Christopher was not deceived, and indeed he came to their house in the evening. Christopher Book and Barbara looked at him in surprise. "Hello, Barbara," the boy replied, embarrassed. "And I'm here to see your Ashley." Barbara looked at him in amazement. "Wow." About the meetings, Olivia's voice came from the back of the room. "It's a little early, daughter," Olivia began. "Sheesh," Barbara shouted sharply and turned to the boy and smiled welcomingly. "Come in, please, Christopher." "You've come," Ashley shouted happily, finding herself on the threshold of the room. "Then I'll definitely make it in time." "But I promise," Christopher said solidly. After working together for 3 hours, the layout was even better. And the next day, Christopher, who lived nearby, carried it to school himself, just in case. Ashley won first place in the contest, and Christopher suddenly realized that he was very pleased to help the brave redhead with the extraordinary clear and pure eyes. A couple of days after their chance encounter, Christopher, for some reason I don't know why, looked into the wing of the school where the little ones were studying. By high school girl standards, he saw Ashley immediately among the other 6th graders. Her red hair and 2 pigtails made her stand out in a big way. It was like she was glowing with some kind of joyful light and illuminating everything around her. At least on a rather cloudy day, it seemed to get brighter around the thin girl, as if an invisible ray of sunlight was coming from her herself. Ashley, the boy called out softly, quite unexpectedly. "Oh," Ashley exclaimed, running up to him and hesitantly stopping a few paces away. "Christopher, hello. I'm so glad to see you. How are you doing? Did you win the contest?" In a slightly muffled voice, he asked. He suddenly felt embarrassed. For some reason, Christopher Foken, a high school student, one of the informal leaders of the school, had stuck up for the kids and was standing like a fool in front of a funny red-haired girl. "Yeah, she won. First place." Can you believe it? She smiled wide across her mouth, and her toothy grin suddenly made it even brighter. "Bloody hell," Christopher said angrily to himself. He wasn't quite sure what was happening to him or why he liked looking at Ashley so much. Well, good for you. Okay, come on, he struggled to find the words. He had never gotten lost in front of teachers or peers before. Christopher turned and took a determined step to the side, but stopped suddenly, turned again to the girl who continued to stand and smile enthusiastically, and added, "If you have any problems, ask me." At the same time, he cast a very expressive glance in the direction of the group of boys, led by Justin, whose eyes were as rounded as possible. The news that the red-headed Ashley and the sixth grader were now under Christopher's personal protection spread quickly through the school and reached the ears of even the most uncomprehending. Anyway, immediately Justin quickly realized that it was no longer safe to bully a classmate. There certainly couldn't be any friendship between a sixth grader and a ninth grader like Christopher. But he treated Ashley like the little sister he never had, and she accepted his unobtrusive patronage with delight and pride. They met periodically at school or on the street. Ashley invariably repaid the favor with a cheerful smile. Christopher just couldn't help but smile back. For some reason, the sight of Ashley's red head always lifted Christopher's spirits. And all the things he had planned for the day worked out just fine. He had come to regard the girl as his personal talisman. It got to the point that when he didn't see Ashley at school before his final essay, he ran to her house with 2 red, ruddy apples as a distraction. After graduating from high school, Christopher, after serving in the army, went to the city to attend technical school. After receiving his diploma, he tried to live and work in the city. But local life was not for him. He was always drawn back home, to his native village, to his mother, friends, loved ones, streets and river banks familiar to the smallest details, old and explored by him from top to bottom and from bottom to top trees, and something else that he could neither understand nor formulate. 3 years later, in the spring, he returned home. Christopher walked down the street, breathing in the fresh air filled with the smells of cherry blossoms and lilacs. He listened to the birds singing and felt idiotically, inexplicably happy. The wicket slammed ahead. It was Barbara's house. A slim, girlish figure dressed in skinny jeans and a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows easily jumped out of the gate. With her back to Christopher, she raised her arms, yanked the hairband from her hair, and her shiny red hair cascaded down her back, backlit by the bright spring sun. It was as if they were creating a glow around the girl. Christopher stopped, utterly amazed. The girl closed the wicket and turned to face him. Her face showed a look of surprise mixed with joy. Her eyebrows crept upward, and he was finally blinded. She flashed him a wide smile. "Ashley, you're here," Christopher exclaimed happily, not believing his eyes. "How have you changed?" "I've grown," she laughed, running up to him. "How do you do?" She held out her narrow palm to him, and he shook it with a kind of awe. The girl seemed to him extraordinary, incredible. More importantly, he realized why he'd missed her all these years. The red-haired Ashley, his mentee, who had grown into a hot bird. "Christopher, can you even hear me?" He finally heard Ashley laugh. She'd been saying something to him for a couple minutes, and he'd been standing in the middle of the street, staring at her and not reacting. "What's wrong with me?" He finally came to his senses. "I said, how long are you staying? Is your mom coming to visit on vacation?" No, Ashley, I'm not visiting. I'm home for good." He finally decided to look her in the eye. "What color are they, blue-gray?" "I don't know." In the bright sunlight, they were almost a heavenly blue. But there's a strand of hair on her forehead, and in the shadows, it looks pearly gray. "That's great," Ashley exclaimed. "Oh, listen, you should come to our prom." "So what if you're older?" "Everyone knows you and remembers you. Do you know how happy everyone would be to see you? Do you?" He didn't know why he said that. "Would you personally be happy to see me?" "Yes," Ashley answered easily and without a second thought. "I'd be very happy." After the prom, which he'd gone to with half the town, he'd suddenly realized that he loved Ashley with a deep, bright, almost sacred love. And maybe he'd loved her all these years without realizing it, without even remembering that she existed. He simply didn't need anyone else but her. Her eyes, her face densely studded with freckles, and her hair flying with flames. "I love you," he told her a week later. "I'll wait for you as long as I have to, if you want to," he added quietly. "Very much I want to," he heard also a very quiet answer. The fact that something important and special was going on between Christopher and Ashley, who had returned home, became clear to everyone very quickly. Potential suitors quickly fell away from Ashley, and Christopher was sadly crossed off the list of the town's first suitors. All they saw was each other. "How could it be?" she said to Christopher. "You've just come back. Things have gotten so wonderful, and you have to break up again." They sat on a bench above the river cliff. He had his arm around her shoulders, and it felt so good. They both wanted it to last forever. Ashley was about to move on to graduate school, and she was anxious about leaving him. "Go," he said firmly, pulling her tighter against him as if he were contradicting his own words, not really wanting to let her go. "Go as you wish, study, and I will visit you often as I can, and you'll come to see me. Well, I mean to your mother, your grandmother, and me." He looked into Ashley's eyes. "I told you," he went on, silently, as if thinking about what he'd said. "I'll wait for you. And then, Ashley, I have to earn you. You'll be studying, and I'll be working and fixing up my mother's house. I can't just fall on Barbara's head with a young wife." He slid off the bench and knelt down in front of Ashley. Looking into her eyes, he noticed her cheeks flushed, emphasizing all her freckles. "With his wife," she whispered. Of course, he took her chin gently and lifted Ashley's face to a low slump. "You'll marry me, won't you?" She nodded. A tear rolled down her cheek. Ashley left to go to school for economics, and Christopher got serious about developing and renovating his parents' old house. They saw each other as often as possible. With each meeting, they were convinced that their feelings were only growing stronger. 3 years passed. Ashley got her degree and moved back home. The moment had finally arrived when she and Christopher could be together truly as man and woman, as husband and wife. Her whole being yearned for it. She wanted it with every fiber of her being, thought about it constantly. And it made it all the harder to hear the news she'd gotten at home. Ashley. Christopher began a conversation for which he had obviously been preparing for a long time. "My girl," he cleared his throat and shook his head stubbornly, continuing in a firm voice, "we need to wait a little longer." "What?" Ashley asked, confused. "Wait for what?" "Well, to get married," Christopher answered confusedly. "You know, Ashley, I'm sorry, I should have consulted you, of course, but it all happened so fast, before I knew it. But Ashley, it's only for a year. And it's money I won't make here in 5 years. You and I are going to make such a living off of it." He kept saying something. She continued to stare at him incomprehensibly, realizing only one thing: he would not marry her. And they were going somewhere apart again. How much longer? She let out something like a sob. "I can't wait any longer. I don't want to." She wrenched her hands from his, jumped up and pushed him with her foot. "Ashley, sweetheart, love," he mumbled, wrapping his arms around Ashley. "I can't and don't want to wait any longer either, but let's just wait a little longer. Please, my love." He hugged her, whispering some words in her ear. All their longing for each other spoke so powerfully that everything was forgotten: the voice of reason, calculations, promises, and propriety. There were only 2 people left in the world, he and she. And they were together. Christopher signed a 1-year contract to serve in the army. He was a fit, healthy, athletic guy, and he was willingly accepted into one of the units that carried out combat missions in a distant African country. Ashley, of course, did not know all the details of the contract, the main thing: the degree of danger to his life. Giving in to persuasion, and most importantly, being somewhere between heaven and earth, after all that finally happened between them, she, of course, agreed to everything. Ashley stayed waiting for Christopher, and 3 months after he left, she realized she was pregnant. Another month later, Christopher came home early. He came back in a zinc coffin. At Christopher's funeral, Ashley, pale and frightened by dizziness, fainted. She woke up at home on her bed with a wet handkerchief on her forehead. Barbara was sitting a little farther away, scrutinizing her granddaughter's face. "How are you?" she asked what seemed to Ashley to be the most stupid and pointless question. Ashley tried to turn away from the wall. "Don't turn away from me, Ashley," she said firmly. "Let's talk. This is, of course, unimaginable grief. Christopher." Her voice trailed off and she quickly wiped her eyes. "Christopher is such a wonderful young best boy we've ever had. Ridiculous, terribly bitter, but he's a man. And he chose his own path. And that path led him to his death. You must realize that and accept it. And go on your way without Christopher. He's gone." "No," Ashley, she stood up resolutely and tried to pull her hands away from the girl's ears. To go on her way. Ashley suddenly opened her eyes and jumped up from the bed. There's no more my way, you know. No. Dead end. A dead end, she sobbed hysterically, cradling her face in her hands. Ashley, my girl Barbara, whose heart was literally breaking at the sight of her granddaughter's grief, put her arm around her shoulders. Believe me, girl, everything passes and this will pass. Time heals. We have to move on. Ashley lifted her tear-stained face to her grandmother and tried to smile a pathetic, shaky smile. Grandma, honey, it's not going to go away, okay? She clutched Barbara to her chest, and her shoulders shook with another attack. With a woman's instinct, with all her experience and selfless, but not very happy life, Barbara immediately realized what was wrong. My God, when did you have time? She gasped. She continued to hold Ashley tightly to her and rocked her as if she were a child. The girl gradually calmed down. Her sobs turned to sobs and mumbling. At last Ashley recovered enough to speak more or less clearly. What are you going to do next? Grandma asked. What do you mean? Ashley asked, puzzled. Have a baby, she said in an unexpectedly firm voice. That's right. Good for you, girl. I'll help you. It was getting dark outside the window, and the two women, old and young, sat hugging each other, trying to process the grief or the unintended, unrecognized joy through their tears. Ashley had a baby boy, healthy and so large that petite Ashley had been in a lot of pain during labor. Olivia had continued to live with her mother and Ashley all these years, but she still managed to exist completely separate from her family. She looked at her grandson blankly and said as if she'd thrown a stone, "It's good that the kid, at least when the time comes, he'll leave someone else, not her." Ashley named her son Jason. The boy was businesslike, solid, always busy with his own little problems. He was like Ashley in character, but in appearance he was becoming more like Christopher every day. Of course, Jason was Ashley's joy, and the only meaning in her life, the anchor that bound her to the present. She'd survived Christopher's death, and the worst months after his funeral only because of the small flame of new life inside her. And even though she had Jason, Ashley was slowly fading away. Skinny as she was literally exhausted. All her brightness was extinguished, faded, exactly as her grandmother Barbara had once been after she'd buried. Chattering, wondering how this family of beautiful, strong women repeated each other's unhappy fate. Jason was 3 years old when Barbara finally couldn't take it anymore. That's it, Ashley, I can't stand to see you go out like a candle, she suddenly declared to her granddaughter. I don't want to see you kicked out of the house. Come on, get ready. Ashley looked at her grandmother wildly, not sure what she meant. What are you looking at me for? The old woman sank down on her. You need to get out of here. You need a change of scenery, a change of job, a change of environment. And it's no good going to the cemetery every day. Are you kicking me out? Ashley asked quietly. Yes, if you want, I am. The old teacher said firmly and changed her tone to one of persuasion. Tanechka, my golden child. It's the right thing to do. It's better this way, believe me, girl. You'll get a job and you'll have a place to live. I've already arranged it. You live, you get distracted. New people, new experiences, new life. Jason came running into the room, and Ashley grabbed the baby and held him to her. Ashley. Grandma looked at her angrily. Stop hiding behind Jason. He's not going anywhere. He's going to stay with me for a while. If things go well, will you take Jason back to your house? Or maybe you'll come home. Tanechka, girl, you've got to try living a different life. I never asked you for anything, but now I'm begging you to go. Ashley listened to her grandmother at first with incomprehension, indignation. What was she talking about? Leaving home? Leaving Jason? Had she lost her mind? Her beloved, always so wise, kind, and infinitely patient grandmother. But gradually the bewilderment gave way to reflection. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her grandmother was right. She really needs to change her life completely and understand what to do next, how and for what to live. 6 months later, after much agony and deliberation, Ashley made up her mind and left for the city. She was taken in by an old friend of Barbara's, also a former teacher, who had a small apartment. From the first day, Ashley started looking for a job in her specialty. She called the classifieds, sent her resume. But everywhere she got a polite, but essentially the same response. Sorry, but we can't offer you this vacancy. She realized that objectively she had little chance. Lack of local registration, relatively little work experience, and a young child in the absence of her husband. All this made her candidacy not very attractive to employers, even though she had a red diploma in economics from a technical school. She was almost despairing and was thinking of returning home when she got an interview at a rather large, apparently well-known in the city firm for the production and sale of furniture. Well, told her in the Department of Human Resources, the place in our accounting department really was. But just this morning we've decided on another candidate. I'm sorry. Ashley was already habitually upset, but suddenly she decided. But maybe there are other jobs available? I really need a job, you know. The HR lady, who had already risen from her seat, sat back in her chair. Maybe it was Ashley's charm, or maybe anger, pity for the young woman. Either way, she gave Ashley a dubious look and stretched out. Well, I don't know. I have an opening, of course. But I don't think you'll accept it. We need an office cleaner. Of course, it was a blow to Ashley's ego. She was a country person and respected any labor, including unskilled labor. Take a few years to learn to come to the city and mop the floor, Ashley thought. She even faltered for a second, but shook her head stubbornly. The money she'd taken with her from home was running out, and she had to either take any job or go back home. I agree. Ashley looked firmly into the HR person's eyes. When can I go to work? You can go to work tomorrow, she replied indifferently. Ashley began to work, and the job itself was not difficult for her. Having been used to labor in the house and vegetable garden since childhood, it didn't seem hard at all. What was discouraging was the attitude of those around her. It was hard for her, accustomed to attention and love, to realize that for others she was an empty place, an appendage to the bucket and mop, who might not even be honored with a simple hello. The office was vast and bustling, with many services and departments. After a while, Ashley remembered by face and by name the managers, leading specialists, and ordinary employees, although for them she was still the girl who was asked to clean, move, or wipe something in addition to her duties. A couple of months had passed, and Ashley was getting to know not only the structure, but also some of the company's business. Olivia, she said one day to the deputy chief accountant, a nervous, rushing woman, "There's something I'd like to tell you." She stopped and looked at Ashley like an insect. "Your girls are throwing documents in the trash when they should be shredding them in the shredder. There's numbers and calculations in there. Just the other day, someone threw out a balance sheet, just like that. You can't do that. Are you trying to teach us how to work?" She arched an eyebrow in response. "I don't need you to tell us what we can and can't do. Mind your own business, sweetheart, and stay out of it." Ashley swallowed the undeserved insult and went on with her work. The pay was good, and she was even able to send money to her family a few times. She missed home terribly and traveled there every chance she got. Soon she saw an unusual excitement in the office, running throughout the huge room. Even she, who had nothing to do with the affairs of the firm, realized that something out of the ordinary was going on. After greeting someone by the hand with a word or a nod, a short, dry, middle-aged man in a suit and thin gold-rimmed glasses walked out with a quick, confident stride. Ashley realized from his tense face and frozen, ingratiating smile that this was an unusual visitor. "Who is it?" she asked Aaron, the young accountant, who had been on friendly terms with Ashley lately, and had even chatted with her a couple of times. "Really?" Aaron's eyes widened. "That's Jason Smith, the CFO. You're new here. He's been gone a long time. He's got family in Miami. Well, his daughter was born there, so he took a long vacation." Aaron went on to recount gossip about the CFO's love life. But Ashley was no longer interested, so she thanked Aaron and went on with her work. That afternoon, Ashley stayed late at work after her shift ended. After spending time washing windows and leaving the cleaning of the CFO's office for last, she was startled to see a streak of light under his door. Ashley stood there pondering what she should do. Then the door swung open. Jason Smith stood in the doorway. "Do you want my office?" She heard a soft, slightly husky voice. "Come in. I was just leaving." He turned his back to her, walked to his huge desk and sat down. Hello, Ashley suddenly decided to address this strict, business-suited man. He looked up and stared at her blankly. He probably would have been just as surprised if a chair had spoken to him. What he asked for some reason. And then, as if realizing, "Excuse me." "Hello." "Jason Smith, I'd like to talk to you," Ashley said. "Or should I say, when I'm taking the trash out of the trash can." And you know I don't mean to gossip or complain, but sometimes I find documents in the trash that could be used against the company's interests if I wanted to. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Then he stood up, walked around the office, and turned to face Ashley. He was looking at her now, not absent-mindedly, but intently and carefully. Now he said, "What kind of documents did you find and what departments? More details, please. And please, sit down." He made an inviting gesture, pointing to a chair in front of his desk. "Jason Smith, once again, I'm not going to complain or set anyone up," Ashley said. "But I've tried to bring this situation to the departmental staff and no one wants to hear me out. And we're talking about personal data, accounting data, your company's financials, I think." Ashley continued, noticing that the man was listening to her very carefully, that we need to tighten control over the handling of documents, especially their disposal. It's not right that I, a simple cleaning lady, know, for example, what the company's revenue was last month and what the current penalty for tax arrears is. Jason Smith leaned back in his chair, his gaze now expressing keen interest. "But I think you're being modest," he said. "You're not an easy cleaner, to say the least. What's your name, by the way?" "Ashley," she said, and looked him in the eye. "And I understand from what you've said that you know about accounting." "Ashley, where are you from?" Jason Smith asked. "Well, I'm an accountant by training," she said. "I don't have a college degree, but I graduated with honors and worked for a couple of years as an economist at a large plant." Seeing that he continued to listen to her attentively and interestedly, she suddenly made up her mind. "I can't say that I'm such an outstanding specialist, but I also noticed errors in the wires, for example." Jason Smith became wary. For example, your accountant uses account 40 goods to record annual production, but you should use account 43 finished goods. Then there will be no error in cost accounting. After all, you already paid a penalty of almost $70,000 last quarter for this error. But nothing has changed. Jason Smith put his gold-rimmed glasses back on his nose and interlocked his fingers. "Amazing. Interesting things you're telling me. A simple cleaning lady, Ashley." But he took a pen and began to write something quickly in his day planner. "You are now clearly out of place, finishing your work today, and I expect you here in my office by 9 o'clock tomorrow." All of this was said in a tone that had no hint of doubt or suggestion that she herself might want something different. The next day, Ashley, dressed in her best pantsuit, to the amazement of the entire office, sat in front of the door to the CFO's office at the gesture of the receptionist. She realized that she was inviting her to come inside. Ashley opened the office door. Jason Smith was sitting at his desk talking on the phone. Yes, exactly what we need," she heard him say. "Perfect for you in every way. And no strings attached. That's all right, I'll call you back." He disconnected the phone and made an inviting gesture with a smile. "Please, sit down, Ashley's cleaning lady." He was quiet for a moment and then continued. "You are certainly out of place here, it's quite obvious. I have a proposition for you. We have a sales branch. Would you like to be the chief accountant there?" The offer struck Ashley so much that it even seemed absurd to her. She looked at him questioningly, trying to see if he was joking. The man sitting across from her was a solid, serious man who clearly didn't have time for such silly pranks. "Me? Suddenly the chief accountant of the cleaning ladies? Chief accountants, and even without higher education. It doesn't happen like that." She looked at her interlocutor in panic. "Don't be so frightened," Jason Smith said. He stood up, walked around the table, and sat down across from Ashley. "Chief accountant is a big word for it. In fact, the firm is small, with only 3 employees and only 1 accountant. He's both chief and staff in one person, so to speak. And I've already made sure that you are quite wealthy as an accountant. By the way," he smiled, "about our conversation yesterday. I've already given orders to check the order of accounting entries. And you know you were right. There are a lot of mistakes, so you should not doubt your own abilities. Wouldn't you agree? Wouldn't you agree?" He glanced at his watch, and then at Ashley, clearly expecting her to answer immediately. When he saw her hesitation, he struck the final blow. "I'm sorry, I forgot the most important thing," he smiled charmingly. "The money question. You are, of course, interested in the question of salary. But let's start with a trial period to agree on $100,000 a month, and then we'll see the results. Do we have a deal?" Ashley, who had never received even a quarter of that amount, was stunned. $100,000 a month. To buy good winter clothes and shoes, to repair the roof of the house, and finally to pay for her grandmother's knee surgery, which she had long dreamed of. All these desires swirled in her head. If she could earn so well, she could really help her family. A chance like that she might never get again. She should give it a try. She should be able to do it. "I agree," she said quietly, and smiled. "Thank you, Jason, for your trust." He looked at Ashley carefully, and for some reason he lowered his eyes, tracing some lines on the desk calendar. It was as if he was hesitating about something. At least it seemed to her, for some reason, that he was confused and thoughtful for a few seconds. But it passed quickly, and in front of her again sat confident in each of his decisions of the leader. "Well, excellent," he said. "From tomorrow you will start your duties. I'll make sure you're up to speed." Ashley threw herself into her work with all her heart. She was a good bookkeeper, and she performed her duties with integrity. But pathological honesty, gullibility, and unsophisticated style are not the best qualities for the chief accountant of a commercial firm with an unclear reputation. She really for a long time did not notice that in parallel with the daily official activities of their firm was some barely noticeable work. Sometimes she came across documents with contents that embarrassed her. For example, one day she found invoices that she had signed earlier as chief accountant, but the recipients had been changed after she had been given large sums of cash to pay for what she was told were some unforeseen expenses. She decided to talk to the holding company's CFO. But Ashley kindly explained to Jason Smith she is no longer a child. It's a common practice. Any commercial firm takes some of its income out of tax. But it doesn't concern you. I have to tell you, work in peace. By the way, you've got a big job coming up opening a line of credit. You remember? Yes, of course, Jason Smith, Ashley said thoughtfully. I'm preparing the paperwork. Good, he smiled thinly. And if all goes well, you'll receive a substantial bonus 3 months after the firm receives the loan. 2 men in uniform entered Ashley's office without knocking. All documents of the firm were arrested, and Ashley herself was accused of large-scale fraud and sent to a pre-trial detention cell. A few days later, Ashley was summoned to meet with her appointed defense attorney. "Hello, Ashley," the man said with an embarrassed cough and continued in a more forceful tone, "My name is Samuel Brown, and I'm your attorney. I will defend you at your trial, and I will try to..." He clearly stumbled and was again embarrassed. "I'll try to get the charges against you dropped, or at least part of them." He looked at her with a long, attentive stare, as if trying to penetrate her soul. She averted her eyes indifferently. "Ashley," he came to the table and sat down across from her. "This isn't going to work. You and I need to establish a rapport, a trust. Otherwise it's not going to work, you know. Tell me, you're innocent of what you're accused of. What does it matter if I'm guilty or not?" She spoke tiredly. "Who cares but me? It matters." "It matters to me very much," he answered excitedly. "Though I'm sure you're innocent anyway. I knew it as soon as I saw you." She looked at the man with some interest and smiled a little. "As soon as you saw me," she interjected ironically. "I wonder how you can work as a lawyer if you make such conclusions based on looks alone. It's ridiculous." But he was clearly embarrassed again. "I'm not much of a lawyer. To be honest," Ashley grinned bitterly. "And neither am I the chief accountant. But even though I'm not very experienced and I don't know much about economics," he continued stubbornly, "I'll do my best to defend you, or at least get your sentence reduced." He tried to say the last word as softly and quietly as possible, but Ashley still flinched as if struck. "So you are charged with accessory after the fact." Ashley listened to his voice and everything he said. The charges and the articles of the criminal code that corresponded to those charges coalesced into a giant, sticky web in the center of which she, a poor, foolish, naive butterfly, fluttered. Samuel Brown, Ashley's lawyer, fought the trial like a knight without fear or reproach. And he himself, in his imagination since childhood, very rich, imagined himself the savior of Ashley, a beautiful lady who was captured by an evil dragon. And he is the only one who can protect and save her. He spent more than one sleepless night to understand the intricacies of the firm's accounting, mountains of documents and invoices, real and fictitious transactions. As a result, having spent several weeks and almost all his savings, he proved Ashley's non-involvement in most of the violations. And the heaviest charge was dropped, but he still could not get her full release. She got 2 years in juvie. Before she left for juvie, Ashley met with her lawyer. She had already come to terms, lived with her fate, and like the women of her family, accepted her fate. Her red hair was braided into 2 braids. Her face was scrubbed clean without the slightest trace of makeup, and she had lost weight and looked more like a frightened 14-year-old girl than a grown woman with years of darkness ahead of her. She seemed almost saintly to Samuel. He'd realized long ago, admitted to himself, that he loved Ashley with all his heart. He was afraid to give away his feelings, but he wanted to at the same time. He couldn't decide whether it would be better for Ashley to know that he loved her, or whether he shouldn't embarrass and disturb her before he left. Ashley looked up at him with haggard eyes and smiled involuntarily. How cute was he after all, her lawyer? Tall, a little stooped, angular but broad-shouldered, with thick, long, uncut blonde hair that kept falling over his eyes, and he kept tucking it back. There was something inexplicably native about him to her. He was a real man, the way her mom said her father had been, the way she remembered Christopher. Ashley drove some incomprehensible excitement inside and spoke up. "Samuel Brown, I am grateful for everything you have done for me. I realize that if it weren't for you, I would have gotten a much longer sentence. I don't owe you the 4 years of juvie you got off me. I probably owe you my life. I know that, and I'll never forget it. But it's already happened, and there's nothing you can do about it, and I'll have to disappear from life for 2.5 years. Wait, don't interrupt me, Sasha. Can I call you that?" He quickly nodded his head in agreement. "You have already done so much for me. Do one more thing. You know I have a family in the village, my mother, grandmother, and son. I don't want them to know what happened to me. Our family wasn't happy enough as it was. And now this. My grandmother is much closer to me than my mom. That's just the way it is. I'm just afraid she's not going to make it through this. Jason. Yeah, I mean, sure, kids get used to everything. But I don't want him to see me in jail, in these clothes, like this. No, not like this." She choked with sobs, but making an effort to restrain herself, angrily wiped her tears and continued. "I wrote the letter. I made up a whole story. I lied about everything. Of course, Grandma won't believe it. But if this letter is brought by a good, sincere person, such as you, Sasha, she might listen, understand, accept and agree to wait. I know I can't. I have no right to hang this on you. But I have no one else. And I can only trust you. I beg you, Sasha, if you can, do this for me." She handed him a few folded sheets of notebook paper, written in small handwriting. Samuel gently took the sheets from her hands and looked into her eyes. "Ashley, Tanetka." He swallowed convulsively. "I'll be waiting for you." Ashley had stood her ground, endured, survived 2 years, keeping herself as a person, pure and whole. She's learned a lot, rethought a lot. She saw and learned things she would never have seen or known in a normal life. Many of the things she saw she would have preferred to never experience. But that's how life happened. She got out of the colony and went to the only place on earth where she was welcome, at least as she hoped, home. On a clear autumn day, she got off the bus and wandered towards her grandmother's house, trying not to be recognized. "Hello, Grandma," she said simply to Barbara, who was furiously beating the dust out of the mat with a stick. The very old woman looked up at her, dropped the stick, and woke up for the time being. So much chemistry. Suddenly a question hammered in Ashley's brain, the answer to which she couldn't remember in any way. Barbara managed her weakness, swiped the tears from her eyes, and slowly approached Ashley. Quietly, she asked her granddaughter and hugged her as she had as a child. Their shoulders shook, but quietly. Again, like as a child, coaxed her grandmother in Ashley's ear on her back, her shoulders, her head. "Quiet girl, my golden girl. It's nothing. Ashley, nothing. Dirt doesn't stick to gold." Ashley looked into Barbara's eyes. There was nothing but love in them. Ashley pressed her grandmother's hands to her face and sighed. She was home. And Jason, she suddenly realized when both of them had calmed down from their first excitement. "Where's Jason?" "Grandma, it's like kindergarten." "You're Jason," Barbara replied. "I'm too old to keep up with your father, you know. Your mother got smart and got a job. So we put him in the garden. A long time ago, about 2 years ago. Yes, he's fine there. He's already the main man there," she laughed. "He's probably forgotten all about me," Ashley said fearfully. "Well, there you go," she said. "Who would let him forget you? We talk about you every day, and he's never parted from your picture. And Andrew keeps telling him his mom's coming back. Mom will be here soon, mom this and mom that. Andrew? Who's Andrew? Ashley looked at Barbara in surprise. Well, there's this new good man. We've been having a hard time without him all this time. You'll get to know him soon enough, she said with a sly look at her granddaughter. By the way, remember where the kindergarten is? Well, it's time to pick up Jason. You go, girl, get your son, you go. Jason had grown and changed a lot since the last time she'd seen him. Ashley didn't even recognize him right away. She stood under an old birch tree by the fence of the kindergarten and waited, not knowing what to do. Jason ran out of the kindergarten gate and sprinted off, not paying any attention to the lone figure standing under the tree. Hi, he shouted to someone, spreading his arms happily. Ashley followed Jason with her eyes and was surprised to see him running toward the man, squatting down to him and spreading his arms wide as well. It was a man. In the twilight of the fall evening, Ashley could only see the outline of the figures and the bright blue stain of a jacket. After a while, she realized that it wasn't so much the twilight as the tears that blurred her eyes. Jason, she whispered to her son. Jason, meanwhile, ran up to the squatting man and hung around his neck. The man wrapped his arms around the baby, lifted him to his full height above the ground, and began to spin him on his axis. It was obvious that this ride had been performed many times before and was familiar to both of them. Jason squealed enthusiastically, and the man laughed. Ashley closed her eyes and pressed her back against the trunk of the old birch tree. For a few moments she thought she recognized Christopher in the man. And going crazy, she thought sadly, swallowing the tears that continued to flow. The merry fiddling continued between the boy and the man, accompanied by children's laughter, squeals, and delighted squeals. The man also continued to laugh and finally said, "That's it. Jason, Christopher, stop the pampering or your pants and shirt will go again." The man's voice sounded familiar to Ashley. She squinted, trying to make him out through the fall twilight and the tears in her eyes. Finally, she recognized the blonde, disheveled hair, the tall, slightly bent figure. It was Samuel Brown, her lawyer. Jason spotted her first. He stopped in his run, as if he had run into an invisible wall, crouched down with his hands on his knees, and leaned over and rushed toward her. "Mom, did you make it?" Ashley squatted down, wrapped her arms around the fleeing Jason, and pulled him against her, breathing in her son's dear, beloved scent hard and tight. The smell she'd dreamed about every night for 2 years. Samuel walked slowly toward her. He squinted myopically. "Hello, Ashley," he said in a voice hoarse with excitement. "Hello, Sam," she replied, also feeling a lump in her throat. "You've gotten even more beautiful, Ashley. I've been expecting you and it's really good to see you." "Glad." Just glad, she looked up at him with a smile. "And here I am, Sam, seeing you, just happy." She brought her face close to Samuel's and kissed his cheek. They walked down the street, rustling the gold and red leaves that carpeted the ground. Jason held onto his mother's hand with one hand and Samuel's with the other, and walked cheerfully between them, jumping up and down every chance he got, making sure to lift as many fallen leaves into the air as he could. It was extremely exciting. And Jason was perfectly content, especially because neither his mother nor Uncle Sam ever scolded him for his outright hooliganism. They had no time for each other, looking into each other's eyes and smiling,